In the quiet solitude of Elkhead Ridge, Oren Thorne lives a life distant from his past, a past filled with loss and regret. But when a German shepherd, severely poisoned and wearing a K9 vest, appears in his life, everything begins to change. This is no ordinary dog. It is a warrior, having witnessed unimaginable horrors and carrying a great secret. As Oren takes the dog into his care, he faces not only the battle to save its life, but also the fight to confront his own past. Who is this dog? And what dark secrets does it hold? You won't believe the truth behind its survival. The morning in Elkhead Ridge always begins with soft light and the chill that seeps from the earth. The sun isn't strong enough to pierce through the thick fog, but Oren Thorne has been awake for a long while. He doesn't need an alarm clock. His body has long since adapted to the rhythm of the mountains, to the sound of the wind creeping through the wooden walls of the old cabin, to the dry pine branches rustling like whispered fingers from the deep woods. Oren's cabin sits nestled in a quiet hollow, 3 sides surrounded by forest, with the other side facing a small creek. No one calls him a neighbor, nor does anyone visit except for the mailman every couple of weeks. The place is nearly 20 miles from the town, and the dirt road leading to his home winds steeply through rocky slopes, enough to make anyone unfamiliar with it turn back halfway. Oren chose this place for that very reason, the complete solitude. Here, no one asks about him, and no one brings up the past. His face is etched with deep wrinkles, but not in the way of someone who has given up. His eyes are sharp, even though sleep rarely comes full and restful. Each step he takes is firm, yet heavy, as if carrying something that has never been set down. He is not old in a way that softens the spirit. Oren Thorne is the kind of man who could live in a snowstorm for 3 days without complaining, so long as he has enough firewood and a cast-iron stove burning steady. His breakfast is simple: black coffee, a piece of burnt toast, and a few slices of dried apples he made last month. He eats slowly, his eyes fixed on the fogged glass window, where the pine forest stretches out, stirring as the sunlight begins to touch it. This is his favorite time of day. Absolute silence, just him and the crackling wood in the stove and the warm scent of pine resin. Oren had once been a head mechanical engineer for an industrial equipment factory in Denver. He loved the work, the precision of every turn, the way gears meshed together like a technical symphony. His life had run as smoothly as the machines he oversaw, until the day the crane in the main workshop unexpectedly collapsed. His only son, Nolan, who had just started working under his father, was the only one who couldn't escape. The coffin was smaller than he had ever imagined. More than the wounds, it was the feeling of falling into a void that would never be filled. His wife, Lyra, didn't blame him, didn't cry much. She simply left a few weeks later, taking 2 suitcases and a small cactus, leaving behind a folded note with hasty handwriting. "I can't stand the silence anymore." Oren didn't blame her. In fact, he hadn't heard anything since that moment. The factory transferred ownership. Friends drifted away. Relatives suggested therapy. But instead of lying on a couch in a sterile, white room, he chose to build a cabin in a place with no phone signal and the nearest house 5 miles away through the woods. 5 years passed. Winters came and went. Bears still occasionally wandered by the creek. The white deer grazed near the trail, unconcerned by his presence. He lived like an anonymous forest ranger, no nameplates, no journals, but he knew every sound of the wind, every scent of the wood, every crack in the steps of his porch. Every morning, after breakfast, Oren would take a small axe up into the woods to chop more dry firewood. He still had strength. The old axe, worn but with a smooth handle, fit his hand perfectly. He used it with the care of a seasoned craftsman, each swing decisive, rhythmic. Just like the way he once tightened bolts, checking the fasteners on the assembly line. Not fast, but accurate. In the evenings, he would sit in a rocking chair on the porch, an old notebook resting on his lap. Inside, there were technical sketches, sometimes mechanical formulas, sometimes pointless doodles. A few times he wrote about Nolan, or simply recorded a fragmented dream. The mountain breeze fluttered through his coat, bringing the scent of pine mixed with the late afternoon sun. In another world, this could be called peace. But for Oren, it was just another day, drifting by like long shadows on the snow. He wasn't exactly lonely, but he didn't allow himself to get close to anyone. Not people, nor animals. 3 winters ago, a stray cat wandered into his yard. It was thin and trembling. Oren set out a box with some old cloth and food scraps, but when it came back again, he didn't open the door. And the 3rd time, it never came back. His world was one of silence, a frozen memory. He didn't push anyone away, just kept everything at a distance far enough not to suffer another loss. Because sometimes, loss doesn't come from death, but from letting someone get too close. That day, the air was still, the wind so light it didn't even stir the dry branches. Oren decided to take a walk along the trail behind his cabin, the path he often walked when he needed to take a deep breath. The path didn't lead anywhere, just a loop around the ridge, ending at a large rock shaped like a horseshoe where the creek split. But he liked it. It was long enough to breathe, and familiar enough not to get lost. Little did he know, that simple walk would open a door in his heart that had been locked for many years. And little did he know, that in the forest he once thought was just trees and rocks, there was a life waiting for him, not to be saved, but to bring him back to being human. The trail behind the cabin curved through tall, towering pines, like old soldiers standing guard over the sky. Beneath Oren's feet, the dry leaves, tinged in shades of copper and red, made a familiar, crinkling sound. He never needed a map. Every twist, every erosion in the earth was deeply embedded in his memory. Perhaps it was because he walked this path every day, or maybe simply because this was the only road left that he was willing to walk. The light breeze from the north rolled down the hillside, carrying the characteristic scent of rotting wood and forest mushrooms. The sun had just peeked over the distant mountain ridge, casting broken streaks of light through the canopy, like cracks in a roof that had long been neglected. Every time the light touched his face, Oren would close his eyes for a moment. Not to enjoy it, but because his body had learned to react that way. Years of living in silence had made every sense sharper. At the familiar bend, where 2 old pine trees leaned toward each other like a natural gate, Oren stopped. Something was wrong. About 10 steps ahead, an unfamiliar shape lay among the decaying grass and fallen leaves, black, gray, and still. At first he thought it was a fallen branch from the night's wind, but instinct whispered otherwise. There was a strange curve, a structure that didn't belong to the trees. Oren squinted. His feet seemed to slow on their own, each step taken with care toward the object. The smell of iron wafted on the wind, a scent of dried blood mixed with old sweat and forest mud. When he was only a few steps away, Oren saw more clearly. It was a dog. A solid black German shepherd, large and muscular but in a sorry state. Its fur, once thick and strong, was now tangled, covered in dirt and dry leaves. And worse was the vest it wore, old, torn, and filthy to the point it was hard to make out its shape, but the stitches, the buckles, he recognized them. Kini. A slow, tight feeling spread through Oren's chest. Even though he had long left the world of machines and systems, he still recognized the signs. That vest was not a toy. It was made for duty, real duty, the kind only dogs in military, police, or special units would wear. Oren knelt beside the dog. His chest moved slowly, his eyes not leaving the still body. The dog's head was tilted to one side, its eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if calling for something in its dreams. He saw a large wound on its rear leg, the blood dried into a black streak. One shoulder was caked in mud, and there were claw marks, likely from a struggle. There was no movement, no breath. Oren took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he had to be sure. His hand, though trembling, gently slid under the dog's neck, resting lightly on the carotid artery. His heart beat slow, his ears straining. Waiting. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. He was about to pull his hand away when a light, faint sensation brushed against his fingertips, like a whisper lost in the wind. A heartbeat. Another heartbeat. Oren pulled his hand back, his eyes wide. The dog was still alive. Weak, but not giving up. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not quite terror, not entirely panic. It was almost a compulsion, like the way he used to rush into the workshop when the alarm rang. No calculation, no hesitation, just action. He shed his outer jacket, wrapping it around the dog's body. Every movement slow, deliberate, as if he feared breaking off a precious shard. No one had taught him how to save an injured K9, but his body knew what to do. "All right, you and me," he whispered, his voice rough like wind brushing over old wood. The dog didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But when Oren slid his hands under its body and slowly began, in the quiet solitude of Elkhead Ridge, Oren Thorne lives a life distant from his past, a past filled with loss and regret. But when a German shepherd, severely poisoned and wearing a K9 vest, appears in his life, everything begins to change. This is no ordinary dog. It is a warrior, having witnessed unimaginable horrors and carrying a great secret. As Oren takes the dog into his care, he faces not only the battle to save its life, but also the fight to confront his own past. Who is this dog? And what dark secrets does it hold? You won't believe the truth behind its survival. The morning in Elkhead Ridge always begins with soft light and the chill that seeps from the earth. The sun isn't strong enough to pierce through the thick fog, but Oren Thorne has been awake for a long while. He doesn't need an alarm clock. His body has long since adapted to the rhythm of the mountains, to the sound of the wind creeping through the wooden walls of the old cabin, to the dry pine branches rustling like whispered fingers from the deep woods. Oren's cabin sits nestled in a quiet hollow, 3 sides surrounded by forest, with the other side facing a small creek. No one calls him a neighbor, nor does anyone visit except for the mailman every couple of weeks. The place is nearly 20 miles from the town, and the dirt road leading to his home winds steeply through rocky slopes, enough to make anyone unfamiliar with it turn back halfway. Oren chose this place for that very reason, the complete solitude. Here, no one asks about him, and no one brings up the past. His face is etched with deep wrinkles, but not in the way of someone who has given up. His eyes are sharp, even though sleep rarely comes full and restful. Each step he takes is firm, yet heavy, as if carrying something that has never been set down. He is not old in a way that softens the spirit. Oren Thorne is the kind of man who could live in a snowstorm for 3 days without complaining, so long as he has enough firewood and a cast-iron stove burning steady. His breakfast is simple: black coffee, a piece of burnt toast, and a few slices of dried apples he made last month. He eats slowly, his eyes fixed on the fogged glass window, where the pine forest stretches out, stirring as the sunlight begins to touch it. This is his favorite time of day. Absolute silence, just him and the crackling wood in the stove and the warm scent of pine resin. Oren had once been a head mechanical engineer for an industrial equipment factory in Denver. He loved the work, the precision of every turn, the way gears meshed together like a technical symphony. His life had run as smoothly as the machines he oversaw, until the day the crane in the main workshop unexpectedly collapsed. His only son, Nolan, who had just started working under his father, was the only one who couldn't escape. The coffin was smaller than he had ever imagined. More than the wounds, it was the feeling of falling into a void that would never be filled. His wife, Lyra, didn't blame him, didn't cry much. She simply left a few weeks later, taking 2 suitcases and a small cactus, leaving behind a folded note with hasty handwriting. "I can't stand the silence anymore." Oren didn't blame her. In fact, he hadn't heard anything since that moment. The factory transferred ownership. Friends drifted away. Relatives suggested therapy. But instead of lying on a couch in a sterile, white room, he chose to build a cabin in a place with no phone signal and the nearest house 5 miles away through the woods. 5 years passed. Winters came and went. Bears still occasionally wandered by the creek. The white deer grazed near the trail, unconcerned by his presence. He lived like an anonymous forest ranger, no nameplates, no journals, but he knew every sound of the wind, every scent of the wood, every crack in the steps of his porch. Every morning, after breakfast, Oren would take a small axe up into the woods to chop more dry firewood. He still had strength. The old axe, worn but with a smooth handle, fit his hand perfectly. He used it with the care of a seasoned craftsman, each swing decisive, rhythmic. Just like the way he once tightened bolts, checking the fasteners on the assembly line. Not fast, but accurate. In the evenings, he would sit in a rocking chair on the porch, an old notebook resting on his lap. Inside, there were technical sketches, sometimes mechanical formulas, sometimes pointless doodles. A few times he wrote about Nolan, or simply recorded a fragmented dream. The mountain breeze fluttered through his coat, bringing the scent of pine mixed with the late afternoon sun. In another world, this could be called peace. But for Oren, it was just another day, drifting by like long shadows on the snow. He wasn't exactly lonely, but he didn't allow himself to get close to anyone. Not people, nor animals. 3 winters ago, a stray cat wandered into his yard. It was thin and trembling. Oren set out a box with some old cloth and food scraps, but when it came back again, he didn't open the door. And the 3rd time, it never came back. His world was one of silence, a frozen memory. He didn't push anyone away, just kept everything at a distance far enough not to suffer another loss. Because sometimes, loss doesn't come from death, but from letting someone get too close. That day, the air was still, the wind so light it didn't even stir the dry branches. Oren decided to take a walk along the trail behind his cabin, the path he often walked when he needed to take a deep breath. The path didn't lead anywhere, just a loop around the ridge, ending at a large rock shaped like a horseshoe where the creek split. But he liked it. It was long enough to breathe, and familiar enough not to get lost. Little did he know, that simple walk would open a door in his heart that had been locked for many years. And little did he know, that in the forest he once thought was just trees and rocks, there was a life waiting for him, not to be saved, but to bring him back to being human. The trail behind the cabin curved through tall, towering pines, like old soldiers standing guard over the sky. Beneath Oren's feet, the dry leaves, tinged in shades of copper and red, made a familiar, crinkling sound. He never needed a map. Every twist, every erosion in the earth was deeply embedded in his memory. Perhaps it was because he walked this path every day, or maybe simply because this was the only road left that he was willing to walk. The light breeze from the north rolled down the hillside, carrying the characteristic scent of rotting wood and forest mushrooms. The sun had just peeked over the distant mountain ridge, casting broken streaks of light through the canopy, like cracks in a roof that had long been neglected. Every time the light touched his face, Oren would close his eyes for a moment. Not to enjoy it, but because his body had learned to react that way. Years of living in silence had made every sense sharper. At the familiar bend, where two old pine trees leaned toward each other like a natural gate, Oren stopped. Something was wrong. About 10 steps ahead, an unfamiliar shape lay among the decaying grass and fallen leaves, black, gray, and still. At first he thought it was a fallen branch from the night's wind, but instinct whispered otherwise. There was a strange curve, a structure that didn't belong to the trees. Oren squinted. His feet seemed to slow on their own, each step taken with care toward the object. The smell of iron wafted on the wind, a scent of dried blood mixed with old sweat and forest mud. When he was only a few steps away, Oren saw more clearly. It was a dog. A solid black German shepherd, large and muscular but in a sorry state. Its fur, once thick and strong, was now tangled, covered in dirt and dry leaves. And worse was the vest it wore, old, torn, and filthy to the point it was hard to make out its shape, but the stitches, the buckles, he recognized them. Kani. A slow, tight feeling spread through Oren's chest. Even though he had long left the world of machines and systems, he still recognized the signs. That vest was not a toy. It was made for duty, real duty, the kind only dogs in military, police, or special units would wear. Oren knelt beside the dog. His chest moved slowly, his eyes not leaving the still body. The dog's head was tilted to one side, its eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if calling for something in its dreams. He saw a large wound on its rear leg, the blood dried into a black streak. One shoulder was caked in mud, and there were claw marks, likely from a struggle. There was no movement, no breath. Oren took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he had to be sure. His hand, though trembling, gently slid under the dog's neck, resting lightly on the carotid artery. His heart beat slow, his ears straining. Waiting. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. He was about to pull his hand away when a light, faint sensation brushed against his fingertips, like a whisper lost in the wind. A heartbeat. Another heartbeat. Oren pulled his hand back, his eyes wide. The dog was still alive. Weak, but not giving up. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not quite terror, not entirely panic. It was almost a compulsion, like the way he used to rush into the workshop when the alarm rang. No calculation, no hesitation, just action. He shed his outer jacket, wrapping it around the dog's body. Every movement slow, deliberate, as if he feared breaking off a precious shard. No one had taught him how to save an injured K9, but his body knew what to do. "All right, you and me," he whispered, his voice rough like wind brushing over old wood. The dog didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But when Oren slid his hands under its body and slowly began to lift it, he felt a slight twitch, a subtle, silent signal. "Keep going. I'm still here." The dog was heavier than he thought. Though its body was emaciated, its muscles were still defined. The first steps back towards the cabin sent a sharp pain through his back, but he didn't stop. With each familiar stretch of trees, he whispered, as if to keep himself awake. "Who are you? How did you end up here?" No answer. But Oren knew that if he turned his back, there wouldn't be another chance. It wasn't just the dog that would die. Something in him would never want to wake up tomorrow. In his arms, a life, its origin unknown, its name unknown, but carrying the last breath of a life that had once fought. And now Oren Thorn, the quiet mountain guardian, was its only remaining hope. Oren's arms tightened around the dog's body, the old flannel jacket now stained with mud and blood. His back drenched with sweat, his breathing growing heavier with each step through the decomposing leaves of the forest floor. The road home wasn't long, just over a mile, but it had never felt so far. The dog in his arms didn't stir, yet Oren could still feel the faint, irregular heartbeat against the animal's chest. It was weak, but it was real, and that kept him moving. When he was about 100 steps from the cabin, Oren could see its silver-gray wooden roof peeking through the pines. It had once been just a shelter, a wooden block pieced together, like the days that passed one after another. But now, it had become the destination of a life-or-death race. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, not releasing the dog. Inside the small cabin, light filtered through the dusty glass window, casting faint beams on stacks of old books, a wooden oak table and chairs, and the fireplace still warm from the morning. He gently laid the dog down on a fur blanket in the corner, the same blanket he used on cold winter nights by the fire. Oren reached for the wall-mounted phone. For the first time in months, he picked it up, not to order groceries or check on the power supply, but to ask for help. His voice trembled slightly as he dialed the number. Green Hollow Clinic, Elise speaking. I need help. I'm Oren Thorn. There's a dog, a K9. It's severely injured, breathing weakly. I'm near the base of Elkhead Ridge. There was a pause on the other end. Can you bring it here? We'll be ready. It'll take more than 30 minutes, if I drive fast. We'll wait. Drive carefully. Oren hung up, grabbed the truck keys. The old Ford pickup sat silently in the wooden garage, a thin layer of dust covering the windows. He opened the back, laid out a blanket, and carefully lifted the dog inside. Its eyes were still shut, but as its head gently touched the blanket, he saw one ear twitch, almost like a reflex. The truck rumbled to life and rolled down the rocky dirt road. Oren didn't press the gas too hard, but his hands gripped the steering wheel as if holding on to each second. The road twisted like a scar on the mountainside. Each bend seemed to echo the engine's heavy breath, and each pothole jolted the truck lightly. But Oren wasn't paying attention. His mind was elsewhere now, not on the road, but on a factory, where he once stood among the sounds of metal clashing like the beat of a marching drum. Oren remembered wearing noise-canceling headphones, his protective suit gleaming, his hands stained with oil, but always alert. He had run an entire production line, stood before quality control boards, been called a living machine because he never let a discrepancy slip through. But the day the main crane collapsed, he had been no more than 10 meters away. Nolan, his son, was inspecting the equipment in the first shift. The crash ripped through the air, followed by screams, sirens, and then a blank space. Oren didn't remember how fast he ran. He only remembered his hands sifting through the pile of metal, shouting his son's name in vain, then collapsing when they pulled a white sheet over him. Precision hadn't saved Nolan. Dedication hadn't saved his family. And since then, Oren no longer believed in the concept of the right time. Not until now. Not until this dog. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The animal still lay motionless, its belly occasionally rising and falling slightly. A small sign, but it was hope. The road to the clinic wound through a short valley, crossing a small wooden bridge, the place Oren had once fished with his son on their first summer. The memories flooded back, but they didn't weigh him down, only made him drive more firmly. When the green hollow clinic cabin appeared amidst the changing red leaves of the maples, Oren barely braked. The truck screeched to a stop on the gravel. Two veterinary technicians rushed out with a stretcher. They carefully took the dog from his arms, moving quickly, efficiently, but with care. The emergency room door slammed shut. Oren stood there, gripping his baseball cap, staring at the glass door that reflected his face. Tired, weathered, and for the first time in years, afraid. Not afraid of losing another life, but afraid that he had let someone into his heart again. The waiting room of Green Hollow Clinic was small, with pale ceramic tile and a few photos of animals that had been healed. A three-legged cat playing with a yarn ball, a husky wrapped in a white bandage around its head. But to Oren, the room held nothing but the ticking of an old clock and the pervasive scent of antiseptic seeping into every corner. He sat on a low plastic chair, still clutching his crumpled baseball cap. From there, he could see the frosted glass door leading into the treatment area, the place where the German Shepherd had just been taken, its body wrapped in bandages, covered with a warm blanket, lying still as though asleep. 15 minutes. 30 minutes. Oren lost track of time. Each time the door shifted, he would jump to his feet, then sit back down. He had lived through emergencies before, production lines catching fire, losing power mid-shift, even when a structure almost collapsed. But none of them made his heart skip a beat like this. Finally, the door opened. A woman in her early 40s stepped out, her figure neat in a turquoise medical scrubs. The light from the ceiling illuminated her black hair, neatly tied back, her face showing both fatigue and seriousness. The name tag on her chest read, Dr. Mireya Lang. Are you the one who brought the dog in? Her voice was soft, but not hurried. Oren nodded and stood up. Is it alive? She hesitated for a second, then nodded. For now. He exhaled, but only halfway. I need to know. Dr. Lang clasped her hands in front of her, her eyes not avoiding his. We've given fluids, administered painkillers, and started stabilizing its body temperature. It's in severe dehydration, malnourished from prolonged starvation. There are 2 deep lacerations on the back, leg, and side, evidence of biting or being dragged. Also, the right ribs are fractured in at least 2 places. Oren swallowed hard. In his mind, he briefly saw the dog lying motionless beneath the leaves, its body stained with blood and forest mud, its breath as fragile as ashes. So, is there a chance? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. We've done everything we can. Right now it's still breathing. Weak but responsive. Its heart rate is slow but steady. No major internal injuries. She paused for a moment. But it might not make it through the night. Oren tightened his grip on the baseball cap in his hands. He didn't ask anything more. There was nothing else to ask. It didn't matter where the dog had come from, which unit it belonged to, or why it was wandering alone in the forest. To him, it was a life, one clinging to its final breath. Could I sit next to it for a while? Oren hesitated. Dr. Lang nodded. Don't touch the injured areas too much, and keep the room quiet. He followed her down a narrow hallway into the intensive care room. The lighting here was softer, the smell of medicine not as pungent. The room had 2 beds. One of them held the dog, its body covered with a blanket, patches of fur shaved off to reveal bruised flesh and stitches. The monitor beside it beeped steadily, the green light flashing. Oren sat in the small chair beside the bed. Up close, the dog looked even thinner than before. Its fur was matted, its claws scraped, but its face, strangely, looked at peace. Its ears twitched slightly as he spoke. Hello, warrior. His voice was barely a whisper. There was no response except for the shallow, fragile breathing. Oren didn't touch it, only placed his hand near its head, close enough that if it moved, he would feel it. "I don't know who you are, where you came from. But if you're gone, it's going to be colder here." The words came out without purpose. They just spilled out like a reflex. Oren didn't know why he said them. He wasn't one to share. But now, in this room, beside a silent creature, he felt lighter for speaking. He told the dog about the old cabin, the winter stove, the crackling wood, and how he had once made a wooden model of a hydraulic press just to kill time. Then, for the first time in many years, he spoke about Nolan, his son, with bright eyes, always smiling, always asking how everything worked. Oren didn't know if the dog understood, but sometimes he felt his finger brush against a faint warmth, like a reply. When he left the room, Dr. Lang was waiting outside. "It reacted to your voice," she said. Oren didn't respond, but his eyes softened for the first time that day. On his way to the car, he paused on the porch, looking at the row of trees in front of the clinic, their leaves changing color. The red maples glowing in the late afternoon sun, a sight that almost took his breath away. Oren took a deep breath. He hadn't found any faith yet, nor made any promises. There was only one quiet decision. He wasn't going to let this creature die. No matter the reason, he didn't need to know. But this time, he wouldn't stand by and watch another life slip through his hands. That night, the sky over the Colorado mountains was clear, with no rain and no moon. Only millions of stars twinkling against the endless blackness. Through the glass window of the ICU, the starlight reflected off the pale walls, creating silent, gentle points of light. But in the room, the only light that shone was from the heart monitor, its steady beeping like a fragile confirmation. It's still here. Oren sat by the dog's bed since the start of the evening shift, never leaving its side. Dr. Lang had suggested he go rest, saying the dog would be well cared for. But Oren just shook his head. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he knew. This animal had entered a place of silence, and if no one stayed by its side, it wouldn't come back. And strangely enough, sitting beside the dog, he didn't feel tired. The German Shepherd still lay still, its breath light and slow, its belly rising and falling rhythmically thanks to a small oxygen tube. The bandages on its chest and legs were still tinged with a little faint red, but stable. Its ears were drooping, its eyes closed. It looked almost like a warrior retreating after a long battle. Oren stared at it for a long while. Suddenly, a question appeared in his heart. "What's your name, warrior?" There were no records, no name tags, no one to claim it, just a creature that appeared as if stepping out of the depths of the forest, carrying with it things that no one had spoken aloud. He leaned against the wall, his eyes still on the still form. "I can't keep calling you it," he muttered, then slowly nodded as if he had just made an important decision. "That's it. You need a name." He breathed slowly. In his mind, old names passed by, the names he had given to mechanical models, to his little son who used to play with him at the drafting table, memories now just fading sketches in the glow of the fireplace. Then suddenly, from somewhere, perhaps from memory, or from the quiet of this room, a name sprang to mind. "Branwen," he said. The name echoed clearly but softly, like the wind brushing through the pine boughs. "Branwen," he repeated, this time more slowly. "It means warrior in the shadows. I read it somewhere back when Nolan was into Celtic mythology." His hand gently rested on the blanket next to the dog's head. "You suit that name." Something strange happened. Whether by coincidence or survival instinct, When he spoke those words, the dog's fluffy tail twitched, a faint movement, almost reflexive. Oren couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. "So, you agree, huh?" he whispered. Branwen, the dog's new name, still didn't open its eyes. But to Oren, that one small movement was enough to count as an answer. The entire night, he didn't leave the room. Every few hours, the nurses came in to check, change the IV, and record the vitals. Dr. Lang also came by twice, offering a brief smile when she saw him still there, then quietly leaving. No one asked why he didn't go home. It seemed like everyone understood. Near dawn, the temperature suddenly dropped. Oren pulled his thinner jacket over his shoulders, still keeping the area around Branwen's head warm with the thick blanket. He sat there, looking out the window, then began to speak. Not loudly, not in any particular order. Just the stories he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years. He spoke about Nolan, from the first time he tried to ride the lawnmower to the last evening when their family was still whole, eating dinner together. He talked about the emptiness when he came home, no longer hearing laughter from the living room, about waking up one morning to find he had placed an extra plate on the table, then quickly put it away again. Branwen didn't react much, but a few times Oren saw its ears twitch, either listening or simply sensing the steady rhythm in his voice. He went on, this time about the cabin, how he had chosen each plank of wood, each stone for the fireplace, about why he never kept any animals, didn't plant more flowers, didn't add another chair, because he didn't want to lose anything else. But tonight, all those reasons suddenly felt distant. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think I'd live the rest of my life without calling anyone's name again. But now, seems like I just called yours." Branwen shifted slightly. This time, it was real. Its whole body stretched a little like a slow stretch in deep sleep. Its heart rate was stable, the monitor still blinked green. Oren rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, his heart was not entirely empty. Tomorrow might still be a fight. Branwen might not survive. But at this moment, in the small room in the cold mountains, there was a man who had learned to call a name again, and a life that seemed to have faded began to breathe just a little more evenly in the dark. The night passed slowly in the dim light of the ceiling lamp. Though there was no moaning, no large movements, Branwen's presence made the space feel oddly alive, as if a quiet fire was smoldering beneath the ashes, waiting for a breeze to ignite it. Oren sat by the bed, his elbow resting on his knee, hands clasped together. His eyes never left Branwen, but his gaze was no longer tense. Now it carried a calm observation, as if he were waiting for something that had already been foretold. When he spoke again, the first thing he received was a response. Small, faint, but clear. One of Branwen's ears twitched, not an involuntary muscle spasm. It turned toward him, as if an antenna listening. Oren held his breath for a moment, then continued. He told Branwen about the first winters at the cabin, about the time he ruined a whole batch of cement just because he was too lazy to measure the water properly. Branwen didn't stir, but when he mentioned Nolan's name, just simply, "The boy was only 16 then," Branwen's tail flicked once. Oren saw it clearly. No illusion, no coincidence. He paused for a moment, staring directly at the dog's face. Its eyes were still shut, but the muscles in its forehead had relaxed more than before. The face, though stained with bandages, showed a quiet peace that could only be felt when someone feels safe. "Are you listening to me?" he asked softly, as if afraid to disturb a rare moment. There was no answer, but Branwen's tail twitched again, this time twice in quick succession. Oren let out a soft laugh, almost inaudible, a laugh that had to be coaxed out of his chest after many years of being buried in dust. Around 4 a.m, he dozed off for a moment. No clock chimed, no light shifted. But that sleep was enough for Oren to enter a realm of memories that had been dormant for too long. In his dream, he saw Nolan sitting at the desk, his slightly curly hair falling over his forehead, holding a small model of a robotic arm. "Dad, I think I've got the axis reversed," the boy said, grinning. And he, in the dream, laughed, a full, round sound that even he hadn't expected to come from his own mouth. The scene shifted. Father and son were sitting in the old truck, Nolan beside him, his head resting against the window, holding a small ukulele. Oren drove slowly, deliberately bouncing the truck over the rough dirt road to hear the laughter echo each time the truck jolted. Then a flash of an image, a helmet falling to the cement floor, the sharp sound of metal hitting hard, and silence, blocking his heart like a cold wall. Oren jolted awake. His breath was heavy for a moment before it slowed, but when he looked beside him, he saw Branwen still there, still breathing, still alive. The room was silent again. But this time, it was a silence that had breath. As the sky began to lighten, Dr. Lang entered, carrying a chart with the dog's vitals. She saw that Oren was still sitting there, still hadn't gone home. On the small table beside him was a cup of cold coffee, the cardboard soaked with a ring of moisture, bearing the marks of time. "You've been talking to him the whole time?" she asked, offering a soft smile. Oren simply nodded. "There's no one else who needs to hear." Dr. Lang moved to the bed, checking the IV line and the monitors. "His numbers are better than last night. His heart rate's more stable. The spasms in his lungs have stopped." She glanced at Branwen. "And I think he knows someone's waiting for him." Oren turned to look. Branwen still hadn't opened his eyes, but there was something in his posture. Lighter now, no longer as tense as when Oren first found him. "Warrior in the shadows," he murmured. Dr. Lang turned her head back. "What?" "Branwen. That's his name." She nodded, not asking anything further. Then she quietly left the room, leaving Oren alone with the life lying there, the life he couldn't bear to leave. That morning, as the sunlight filtered into the room through the small window, reflecting off the white floor, Oren was still there, still telling stories, still sitting beside the small bed. And in the middle of the dim light, the sound of the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, like the heartbeat slowly being awakened. The next morning, clouds hung low over the mountain range, like a gray mist covering every movement. Inside the clinic, the light remained soft, the monitor still beeped steadily, and Branwen, still lying still, but now able to breathe on his own without the oxygen tube, was there. Oren sat beside him as usual, but this time with a cup of still warm coffee. Beneath his hands was Branwen's vest, taken off the night before to tend to the wounds on his chest. Elise, the young veterinary assistant, had neatly placed it in a plastic bag and handed it to Oren when he asked. The vest was heavier than he expected. The bulletproof fibers still held their shape, despite being torn in several places. There were dark blood stains near the left shoulder strap, and one of the zippers was nearly torn apart. But what kept Oren from looking away was the faded lettering on the chest. K9 Tactical, and a barely legible serial number, only the last few characters still visible. 173. Oren wasn't a military expert, but he had assembled drones for a defense contractor 20 years ago. He recognized the non-standard details, the steel snaps with coded markings, the reflective patches positioned where only professionals would know to place them, things that were never used in local law enforcement. "Who are you, Branwen?" he muttered, his fingers trailing over the worn fabric. At that moment, the door to the room opened. A deep but calm voice called from outside. "Hello, Oren. I hear you've got something I need to see." He turned his head. The figure entering was a familiar one. Tall, salt and pepper hair shaved close to the neck, wearing a worn brown leather jacket. It was Sheriff Silas Drevin, an old friend from when Oren still lived in town, now the man in charge of keeping order in the county. They only met once or twice a year, usually to fix the generator or change the oil in the mountain station. Oren stood up and extended his hand. "I thought you were busy with the theft case in Ridge Creek." Silas shook his hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "Still busy, but when Elise called and said there was a dog wearing a tactical vest that didn't match any unit in the state, I knew I had to come up the mountain." Oren pointed to the vest on the chair. "It was wearing this when I found it." Silas picked it up, turned it over, and examined the inside. His brow furrowed as he saw the serial number printed on the lining. "No registered unit in Colorado has this kind of vest." "Could it be private training?" Oren asked. Silas shook his head. "Not even civilian K-9 centers use tactical gear like this. This kind, it's used for sensitive operations. It could belong to federal forces or a covert special unit." He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of the serial number, and sent a message to someone. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. Silas read it, then looked up, his expression more serious. "What I just received shouldn't be here." Oren narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Silas lowered his voice. "This serial number used to belong to a federal K-9 Special Forces unit. It has a red code. A year ago, the dog with this number was reported missing during a mission at a training site in northern Wyoming. The last note in the file, body unrecovered, presumed dead." The room seemed to grow colder. Though the monitor continued its beeping, Oren felt his heart skip a beat. "Branwen, survived all that time?" he asked. "Seems so, and that means—" Silas hesitated. He most likely saw things that people don't want made public. Oren sat down, his hand instinctively rubbing his knee. Branwen continued to breathe lightly, seemingly unaware that he was the center of a series of unsolved questions. Silas stepped closer, staring down at Branwen for a long while. "I've seen some excellent K-9s, brave, intelligent, loyal to the point of ignoring pain. But surviving over a year in the wild with injuries like that? There's got to be a reason." Oren nodded slightly. "I think so too. He didn't give up, even when no one called him back." Before leaving, Silas placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I'll investigate further. But Oren, if anyone asks, just say he's a stray dog. Don't post pictures. Don't put it on the internet. Not everyone wants Branwen to have survived." Oren gripped his hand firmly. "I won't let anyone take him. Not again." Silas looked at him, silent but nodded. A nod that carried a promise between two men who had lost more than they cared to admit. When the room fell quiet again, Oren returned to sit beside Branwen. He placed his hand on the blanket, not too close, but enough to share warmth. "So, you're the secret that was buried," he whispered, his voice no longer just thoughtful, but a commitment. "You didn't just survive, you came back." And this time, whether it was just a deeper breath than usual or a small, almost imperceptible movement of his paw, Branwen responded. That afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Gray clouds swirled around the mountain peaks, as if signaling a storm was about to roll down. But inside Green Hollow Clinic, no one paid attention to the weather. All attention remained on Branwen, the dog who had just escaped death now peacefully sleeping on a warm cushion, its breath steady, its chest rising and falling clearly. Oren sat by the window, cradling a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His posture was quiet, his gaze looking through the fogged glass as if he were watching something beyond sight. For the entire morning, he and Branwen had enjoyed a peaceful moment. No doctors, no technicians, no bad news. But peace never lasts forever. Around 3 in the afternoon, the phone at the front desk rang. A minute later, Elise hurried to the break room and called Oren out. "Mr. Oren, someone needs to talk to you. It's Sheriff Drevin." Oren went to the desk and picked up the phone. "I'm listening." Silas's voice came through the receiver, low and urgent. "I found something, Oren, and you need to listen carefully." "Go ahead." "I contacted an old acquaintance. He works with a biological special forces unit, has supported federal research programs. I sent him the serial number of the vest Branwen wore. He sent back just one thing, the code name Protocol Noxus." Oren frowned. "Sounds like a classified program." "Not just classified, Oren. Top secret." Protocol Noxus was a canine training program for biological missions, but not just behavior training. They integrated nanotechnology to enhance reflexes, improve survival rates, increase scent recognition, and enable chemical analysis. In short, they turned these dogs into living tools for both biological warfare and counter-terrorism. Oren fell silent, unable to speak. "And Branwen," Silas continued, "was one of the first 5 test subjects." Oren's heart raced in his chest. "He was a test subject?" "Not just that. The dog carries a special biological microchip, not from any civilian manufacturer, and according to the data I found, Branwen's chip was never supposed to be made public." "Why not?" "Because the program failed. The data leaked, an off-control mission led to 2 deaths, and the entire team was disbanded. Everything was covered up under the guise of missing undetermined. The specimens, including Branwen, were listed as destroyed." Oren gripped the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "So, if Branwen is alive, he's the only living proof." "Exactly. And if someone's trying to keep everything quiet, they wouldn't have just let that dog wander the woods without following up on the trail." Oren glanced over his shoulder, where the small wooden door leading back to the treatment area remained shut. "Can the location be tracked from that chip?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Silas replied. "But if they designed it to collect data, there's no reason it couldn't be tracked. You need to be careful. I'm asking my friend to check the chip's operating frequency. If we're lucky, we can disable it." "And if not?" Silas paused for a moment. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Then you need to disappear." Oren placed the receiver back down. His heart hadn't fully settled, but his expression had changed. Not shock, but a quiet calm. He recognized this feeling. Like when he first heard about the factory collapse, the 8-ton block of steel falling onto assembly line 4. Or the moment the doctor stepped out of the ER, shaking his head, and everything inside him fell, not from shock, but from the feeling of helplessness while still having to hold it together. He turned and walked back to the treatment room. Branwen was still lying there, eyes closed, his form peaceful. But now, Oren didn't just see a creature in need of rescue. He was looking at a witness, a living testament to something that had been buried in the dark. He sat down beside him, and for the first time in many years, he felt his hands actually have a reason to grip tightly. "People might think you're just a dog," he said, his voice deep. "But I know better. You're what an entire system tried to silence." Branwen didn't open his eyes, but just like before, his tail flicked very slightly. A single motion, like a quiet confirmation. Oren placed his hand on his knee, telling himself, "You didn't just survive to breathe. You survived to speak the things they wanted to forget, and I I will be the one who won't let them forget. That night, the mountain sky had no stars. Clouds stretched in long, heavy strands, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for an unnamed storm. The wind wasn't strong, but it was cold. The cold didn't come from the weather. It came from an instinctive feeling, from a vague sense that something was drawing closer, slowly and persistently, like darkness creeping beneath the bed. Oren sat in the cabin, the yellowish light from the wood stove casting reflections on the time-worn wooden walls. He had just made himself a cup of mint tea, a habit from when his wife was still alive, and set it down on the table, yet to take the first sip. Branwen lay near the door, on the deer-hide rug by the stove. His body was relaxed, but not limp. His ears were still facing toward the porch, his eyes half closed, but his eyelids flickered slightly with each shift of the wind. Oren had grown accustomed to that alertness. Since learning about Protocol Noxus, he no longer allowed himself to fully relax. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a stronghold. An additional motion sensor light was installed on the porch. Beneath the floorboards, a compartment held an old Remington rifle, the one he had used for hunting 10 years ago. No wild game was targeted anymore. Now the rifle was meant only for what might step out of the darkness. And then, just as the clock struck nearly midnight, Branwen sprang up. No barking, just a low, deep growl. The sound was enough for Oren to understand. This wasn't a warning for wild animals. He moved quickly to the window. Outside was dense darkness, but about 200 meters from the tree line, just below the slope leading to the open area in front of the cabin, a faint car light flickered out. Oren squinted. An SUV. Black. No front license plate. The vehicle didn't move. It didn't flash any emergency lights. It simply sat there silently, as if listening to the house. Branwen was now fully standing, the fur on his neck raised. Though still recovering from his injuries, barely a week out of danger, he stepped in front of the door, blocking Oren's view of the outside. No howling, no panic, just a ready stance, as if instinct was telling him. This was the reason he was still alive. Oren walked to the cabinet. His hand unlocked the bottom compartment, pulling out the Remington. The ammunition had been loaded earlier in the day, not aimed at anyone, not directed at anyone. He simply opened the front door wide and raised the rifle toward the sky. The shot rang out, echoing through the mountainside, bouncing off the trees like thunder. The SUV didn't start. But a few seconds later, its rear lights flickered on, and it slowly reversed down the dirt road, disappearing into the fog. Leaving only the silence stretched tight like a bowstring, yet to be released. The next morning, when Sheriff Silas Drevin arrived at the cabin door, his face was dark. "Did you see the vehicle?" he asked immediately after stepping inside. Oren poured coffee and set it on the table. Black SUV, no plate. Engine off. Parked for over 10 minutes. Silas sat down and pulled out a different phone, not his work device. "I called a friend at the bureau. They confirmed an unusual electronic signal near the cabin around midnight. It came from a high-end mobile device, one used in covert operations." Oren didn't speak, but his hand tightened around the ceramic cup. "It's likely that's a group tracking Protocol Noxus," Silas continued, "a faction that funded the project. Not the military, but a biological technology cartel. They were believed to have secretly used nanotechnology to manipulate biological behavior, serving both civilian and illicit purposes." Oren looked at him, his eyes sharp as wood cut across the grain. "They're here for Branwen." Silas nodded. "Because he's alive, and still carrying the original microchip. He's the only living evidence that could expose everything. And they'll come back." "Certainly." Oren stood up and walked over to the window, where Branwen lay basking in the sunlight. He wasn't tense anymore, but every strange sound outside still made him blink and lift his head. A primal instinct was still awake, though his body hadn't fully recovered. He sat down beside him, gently rubbing the dog's neck, where the stitches were still healing. "They say you're a relic," Oren whispered, "but to me you're the only thing that's made me stop seeing death as the worst thing." Branwen lifted his head, his eyes meeting Oren's. In that gaze, there was no fear, only understanding, and something that the watchers outside the woods would never anticipate. Branwen wasn't just a dog. He was the last survivor, and ready to fight again. Since the night the black SUV appeared and disappeared into the fog, the cabin on the mountainside was no longer just a place of pure silence. It was still peaceful in its own way. The smell of pine wood burning in the stove, the sunlight filtering through the window every early morning, the wind softly tapping against the glass every time dusk fell. But beneath that calm, there was a new feeling. Wakefulness, alertness, caution. And since that night, something else had changed. Branwen was no longer just a rescued guest. He had truly become a companion. Not by entering, but by staying. At first, Oren placed a folded blanket in the corner of the living room near the stove, thinking that Branwen would be more comfortable there while recovering. But on the very first night back from the clinic, Branwen didn't lie there. Instead, he tugged the rug gently in front of the rocking chair, the spot where Oren always sat to read at night, and lay down, his body pressed close to Oren's legs, as if standing guard. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Oren asked, surprised but not angry. Branwen didn't respond, of course, but a slow blink and a slight lowering of his head were enough for Oren to feel no need to push him away. From then on, that became Branwen's default position. Whether he slept by the window during the day or followed Oren outside to chop wood. By nightfall, he always returned to that spot, as if it were an old habit or an instinct that had never turned off. Oren realized that something quietly shifted within him every day. Trust was returning. Not the kind of trust meant for the world, but a smaller, more intimate kind, the belief that he could open his heart without immediately fearing loss. That attachment doesn't always lead to an ending. That sometimes a creature who cannot speak listens better than anyone else. They started to understand each other through things that didn't need words. In the mornings, when Oren opened the cabin door, Branwen would rise without a signal, silently walking beside him along the wooden fence. No leash, no command. When Oren sat down to write a few lines in a journal, a habit he had long abandoned, Branwen would lie a few steps away, eyes closed, but ears still alert, ready to flick open if Oren shifted even slightly. When night fell, all Oren had to do was reach for his jacket, and Branwen would leap to his feet, as if saying, "Wherever you're going, I'm going with you." One afternoon, as Oren struggled to close the old shed door behind the garden, he suddenly stopped. The sun was setting behind the pines, turning the sky into a diluted orange hue. Branwen sat behind him, his head tilted slightly, silently observing. In that moment, Oren thought of Nolan. When he was little, Nolan would sit like that, silently watching his father do everything, his eyes filled with curiosity and absolute trust. Oren had once feared losing that feeling, afraid that if he allowed himself to open up to any creature, he would lose it again. But Branwen wasn't Nolan. He didn't come to replace him. He just filled a space that even Oren hadn't dared to name. That night, as he sat by the fire, a cup of hot tea in hand, Oren turned to look at the dog sleeping with one ear still perked. "You know," he said, his voice like wind through the leaves, "I once thought I'd die without anyone by my side, but you're here, and I think I need you more than you need me." Branwen opened his eyes, not quite waking, but enough to lift his head and meet Oren's gaze. In that look, there was no fear, only understanding, and something that the watchers outside the woods would never anticipate. Branwen wasn't just a dog. He was the last survivor, and ready to fight again. Since the night the black SUV appeared and disappeared into the fog, the cabin on the mountainside was no longer a place of pure silence. It was still peaceful in its own way. The smell of pine wood burning in the stove, the sunlight filtering through the window every early morning, the wind softly tapping against the glass as dusk fell. But beneath that calm, there was a new feeling. Wakefulness. Alertness. Caution. And since that night, something else had changed. Branwen was no longer just a rescued guest. He had truly become a companion, not by entering, but by staying. At first, Oren placed a folded blanket in the corner of the living room, near the stove, thinking Branwen would feel more comfortable there while recovering. But on the very first night back from the clinic, Branwen didn't lie there. Instead, he tugged the rug gently in front of the rocking chair, the place where Oren always sat to read at night, and lay down, his body pressed close to Oren's legs, as if standing guard. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Oren asked, surprised but not angry. Branwen didn't respond, of course, but a slow blink and a slight lowering of his head were enough for Oren to feel no need to push him away. From then on, that became Branwen's default position. Whether he slept by the window during the day or followed Oren outside to chop wood by nightfall, he always returned to that spot, as if it were an old habit or an instinct that had never turned off. Returning to the cabin, Oren quickly cleaned the wounds, warmed the boy, and then called Silas to have someone come verify his identity. While waiting, he gave the boy a warm glass of milk and a hard biscuit that had been left out the night before. The boy sat on the wooden chair by the stove, cradling the cup with both hands. His eyes followed Oren's every movement, silently but without fear. "What's your name?" Oren asked, his voice gentle. After a moment, the boy replied, his voice soft like a breeze. "Elion." Oren paused. Elion. That name sank into Oren's heart like a stone dropping into a pond that had once seemed still. It was the name Lyra, his wife, had mentioned in the final letter she sent, a few months after leaving. She had said she was pregnant, but wasn't sure what would happen. He hadn't believed her, hadn't dared to believe. He looked down at the boy. Those eyes. Those were the same eyes. Brown, with thick lashes, the gaze deep and calm, just like Nolan when he was young. It couldn't be, but reason told him it could be. Somehow this boy had found his way to him, or had been led by Branwen, in a forest that no normal person would enter. Just then, Branwen gently moved closer to Elion. He didn't bark, didn't nuzzle, just quietly lay down beside him, resting his head lightly on the boy's knee. Elion didn't pull away. Instead, he placed a hand on Branwen's head and gently stroked it. Oren stood still, his chest warming little by little. When Silas arrived, all the confirmation was clear. A missing person report had been filed earlier that morning. A boy had gone missing from a rest stop near the border 3 days ago. The guardian was a woman named Lyra, who had once lived in the town to the south, and had once carried the Thorne surname. Oren held the verification file, his hand trembling. "He's your nephew, Oren," Silas confirmed. "No doubt about it." Oren glanced over at Elion. The boy was now asleep in Branwen's embrace. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't by chance. It was a closed circle, a life he had thought lost, now returned in the form of a boy, guided by the very dog he had saved. Branwen, the survivor from the shadows, had brought the light back. The morning after that fateful night, The early sunlight poured into the cabin as if something sacred was being healed from within. Everything seemed calmer than usual. The maple tree by the porch stood still, unmoving, the ground damp but smelling of wood and fresh moss. The air felt cleansed by a night's rain that Oren hadn't even noticed. Inside the cabin, Elian was peacefully sleeping on the sofa near the fire, his small frame curled up in the thick wool blanket Oren had knitted back when he lived with Lyra. The boy's face was completely relaxed now, no longer showing signs of fear or tension. Beneath the sofa, Branwen lay watchfully, not like an ordinary dog, but like a guard who knew exactly who he was protecting. Oren sat at the wooden table, his hands wrapped around the teacup, his eyes never leaving Branwen and Elian. He noticed that the dog had never left the boy's side, not for a single night. Even when Elian had a slight fever in the middle of the night, Branwen was the first to stir, lift his head, and tap his paw lightly against the wooden floor as a silent alarm, before Oren even noticed. Now that Elian was temporarily safe, the cabin had a new rhythm, a pulse of 3, an old man with the face of loss, a dog that had walked out of the shadows, and a child like a seed of life left behind in a world that had turned away. Silas and his team were still working on tracking Lyra's whereabouts, Elian's mother, but every lead was fading. The phone lines were disconnected, and the registered address was no longer occupied. The picture was becoming clearer. Lyra was likely running from something, and somehow Elian had slipped from her grasp and wandered into the one place on the map, the place where he had blood ties, without even knowing. Oren didn't tell Elian everything right away. The boy was still too young, still exhausted. Instead, he allowed him to live in the peace that the cabin could offer, at least for now. Every morning, he would cook him a bowl of oatmeal with honey and wild berries. The boy would finish it without complaint, always smiling and saying thank you. The way Elian said thank you made Oren's heart ache, because in the boy's eyes he saw something he had lost long ago, pure trust. And what made Oren feel that this was fate was Branwen. Not once had Branwen allowed anyone to get too close to Elian without careful observation. When Silas came by with the identity verification papers, the dog stood between the boy and the door, his eyes so alert that even Silas had to laugh. He makes me feel like a stranger in my own county. But as soon as Oren nodded and said, "It's fine, he's a friend," Branwen immediately stepped back, no longer tense. It was as though he completely understood the language between people, or at least understood Oren's language. Once, Elian had asked, "Uncle Oren, why does Branwen follow me everywhere?" Oren was washing the cup when he paused, turned around, and smiled. "Because he thinks you're the most valuable thing in this house." Elian giggled, rubbing Branwen's head. "So, I have my own bodyguard?" Oren didn't say anything. He just nodded, then turned his face away, hiding the smile that threatened to spill from the corners of his eyes. One afternoon, the sky turned overcast. Elian was napping in the small room Oren had recently renovated. Oren was outside, sawing wood on the porch, preparing a pile for the night's fire. Branwen lay at the bottom of the steps, head held high, eyes fixed on the forest behind the cabin. Suddenly, Branwen stood up, letting out a low growl from deep in his throat. Oren immediately stopped his work, walking over to look in the direction of Branwen's gaze. There was nothing clear, just the shadow of trees, but instinct told him. Something was moving. "Do you see something?" he asked softly. Branwen didn't growl again, but he stepped down from the porch, slowly and precisely, as if every movement was calculated. It wasn't until he stopped and lifted his ears higher that Oren heard it. A faint sound, like leather shoes brushing lightly over the forest leaves. a sound that didn't belong to deer or squirrels. Someone was watching. Oren stood still, his eyes not leaving that spot. He moved inside, locked the door quietly, and pulled the curtain over the window. Branwen didn't move from his position. There was no break-in, no confrontation. But the presence was as clear as ink spreading in clear water. Oren looked up at the stairs, where Elian was sleeping peacefully. "You didn't bring him here by accident," he whispered to Branwen. And Branwen, as if understanding every word, moved closer to him, gently resting his head against Oren's hand, a gesture of both commitment and a silent vow. Oren stroked the dog's spine. "The circle is closed," he said. "You didn't survive just to tell the old story, but to protect the next chapter." That night, the wind howled louder than usual. The sky seemed to shatter into thick clouds. No moon, no stars, just darkness covering the dry branches in the woods behind the cabin. The flickering light from the stove cast yellow glows through the frosted glass, creating a small pool of warmth in the midst of the dark. Oren didn't sleep. Since seeing signs of someone watching 2 days ago, he had only taken brief naps, always waiting until Branwen was fully calm. Each night, after Elian had settled on the upper floor, Oren sat by the wooden table with the Remington close by, his eyes fixed on the front door like an old sentry. Branwen was different. He hardly slept. For nights on end, he lay close to the door, his ears always alert, his nose occasionally sniffing the air as if testing each gust of wind. Oren knew well, if anything unusual happened, Branwen would be the first to sense it. And tonight, it happened. No signal, no sound. Branwen suddenly stood up, letting out a low growl deep in his throat, a sound that only came when there was a real threat. Oren immediately grabbed the gun and walked to the door. The porch light flickered on, activated by the sensor. But what reflected in the light wasn't a wild animal. It was the shadow of a person. 3 figures, standing about 50 meters from the cabin, beneath the dark pine canopy. 2 of them were dressed in black from head to toe. Long coats, hoods pulled low, combat boots. The third person, standing a step back, seemed to be observing. Branwen growled again, his body tense like a drawn bowstring, fur standing up along his spine. Oren didn't need to ask. He flicked the safety off, stepped outside, and raised the gun high. Bang! The gunshot tore through the air, echoing through the mountains and then fading into the forest like dry thunder. The air thickened, like winter resin. The figures stood still for 3 more heartbeats, then retreated. Quick, quiet, without a sound. But before the last one turned away, he tilted his head toward Oren and spoke in a hoarse voice. "We'll be back, Mr. Thorne. Next time, it won't just be a warning." Oren gripped the rifle's stock, his lips pressed tight like a crack in granite. Branwen still growled but didn't chase. He stood beside Oren, as if knowing that the threat had just begun. The next morning, Silas Dreven arrived at the cabin earlier than usual, his police car parked in front of the yard, the lights casting a glow through the cold mist. Oren led him inside and poured a hot cup of coffee. They came back. Silas didn't ask who anymore. His voice was low. "I think I figured it out." He pulled out a crumpled folder from his jacket pocket and opened it in front of Oren. 3 men with prior convictions related to international mercenary activities. 2 of them used to work for a private security company called Helix Corporation. They had financial ties to a project funded by a government subcontractor, the codename Protocol Noxus. Oren's voice grew stern. "Mercenaries?" Silas nodded. The kind hired to do things that others don't want on the record. Oren remembered the cold, hard gaze of the one who stood last. It wasn't the kind of look that came from anger or threat. It was the look of someone fulfilling a contract. "Is the target Branwen?" Oren asked, though he already knew the answer in his heart. "Not just that." Silas gently pulled a printed sheet from the fax machine. "I just received news. There's a rumor circulating in the underground that the living specimen of the PN project isn't just one individual anymore." Oren froze. "You mean Elion?" Silas didn't answer directly. "It's still too soon to confirm. But if Elion is connected to any part of that past, if his mother knew or witnessed anything, then both of their existences are a leak risk." Oren sat still for a long while. His hand unconsciously moved to Branwen's head. The dog was lying next to his feet, eyes still focused on the window looking out at the woods. "So everything's connected," Oren said slowly. "Me, Branwen, and Elion. A circle." Silas sighed, his eyes betraying the conflict within. "I can arrange witness protection, but to do that, you'll have to leave here. Go somewhere else. With a new name, new records. Everything will be wiped clean." Oren shook his head almost immediately. "No," he replied, his voice not loud but as firm as stone. "I've spent my life running from pain. The first time I face it, you want me to run again?" "No." He looked toward the stairs, where Elion was walking down with a long sweater reaching almost to his knees. "I won't run. I'll stand here with him," he said, then bent down, stroking Branwen's head. "And with him, the one who's been through hell and back, not to keep running, but to guard." Silas looked at him and didn't ask further. Because he knew. When Oren Thorne said something in that tone, nothing could sway him. Outside, the sun had just risen over the mountain range. The sunlight filtered through the glass, casting 3 shadows. An old man with a determined gaze, a dog named after the shadows, and a child, smiling innocently, as if he had never known what the world outside had to offer. The sky over the western range was tinged red from the dawn, but it wasn't the peaceful red of early morning sun. It was the glow of a fire burning inside a man who had stopped fearing. Oren Thorne stood on the cabin porch, his hand gripping a hammer, his eyes brighter than ever. He was no longer the one hiding in the woods to escape the pain of the past. No longer the one living just to wait for his life to quietly end. Since Branwen had appeared, and especially since Elion had crossed through that cabin door, he knew the past was no longer the only thing defining who he was. And this time, he would not back down. The cabin had completely transformed. In the span of just 3 days, with the help of Silas and a few old friends who still owed Oren more than just a warm meal, the simple wooden house now resembled a small fortress. Oren had added a steel wire fence around the perimeter of the cabin. Metal posts were driven deep into the ground and rock, connected by barbed wire hidden beneath a layer of fake shrubbery. The windows were reinforced with mobile barriers made from alloy panels he had kept from old projects. On the roof, a system of motion-sensing lights and cameras linked to a small screen placed in the kitchen. Silas brought a low-frequency jamming device, capable of blocking basic location signals within a 100-meter radius, just temporary, but enough to interfere with anyone tracking Branwen's biological chip. Branwen, from a dog who once lay weak and exhausted in the brush, had now become the living soul of the house. He patrolled the cabin every night, leaving no corner unchecked. His shadow glided past the fence like a breeze, his ears always erect, his eyes always open, even when it seemed he was resting. No one told him to do this. He chose to. Elion was no longer the shy child he had been when first found. Every day, Oren spent time teaching him how to gather firewood, peel vegetables, and even how to start a fire in the woods with rocks and a knife. The boy learned quickly, but what touched Oren most was how Elion looked at him, with eyes that didn't question, that didn't need explanations, as if he had felt it. This was where he belonged. And when Branwen lay beside Elian each night, the part of his shoulder no longer bandaged, but still warmed by each breath, Oren knew he wasn't fighting alone. One afternoon, when Silas returned with more information from the feds, he sat down in Oren's old, faded wooden chair and asked, "Still sticking with your decision?" Oren was re-chiseling the doorframe, not looking up. "I've spent my life thinking I wasn't strong enough to hold on to anything, but now I know. I don't need to be strong. I just need not to let go." Silas pursed his lips, nodding silently. He handed Oren a file. Inside were satellite images of the area, a list of individuals hired by Halleck's Corp, and news that the mercenaries had moved closer to the mountain range. "They're coming," Silas said. "And I'll wait," Oren replied. That night, the wind blew harder, the sky sprinkled with stars. Oren sat by the fire, the old guitar he had found in the storage shed strumming out deep, melancholic notes. Elian leaned his head against his shoulder, eyes half closed. Branwen lay at their feet, not sleeping, but not tense either. The rhythm of the room now was an unspoken symphony between man, dog, and blood. No one spoke, but it wasn't needed. In the firelight, Oren's voice broke the silence softly. "If they come, I can't promise we'll win. But I promise you, they won't take anything from here easily." Elian chuckled softly, gripping Oren's sleeve. Branwen let out a low growl from his throat. A declaration. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. And in that warm, lit cabin, 3 survivors were ready. Not to flee, but to fight. That morning, the cabin was bathed in sunlight. Winter had not yet retreated, but the light seeped through the window like golden honey pouring over the wood that had weathered years of time. The warmth from the stove spread throughout the room, carrying the scent of pine resin and freshly baked bread, something Elian and Oren had made together since early morning, though most of the flour still clung to the table and to the sleeves of both of them. Branwen lay stretched out beneath the window, his back pressed against the wall, eyes half closed. But one ear was still directed toward the wooden table where Oren and Elian sat. After breakfast, Elian sat folding paper airplanes from Oren's old notes, unfinished designs that had been stored away from the time he had worked as a mechanical engineer at an aircraft manufacturing plant. Instead of growing frustrated, Oren only smiled, then quietly sat next to the boy, folding another plane. Silence. Gentleness. A feeling very strange to someone who once thought he would never live through a morning like this again. By noon, Silas stopped by. He brought a few cans of food, some parts to repair the lighting system, and a surprise. "I've got news from the federal agency," he said as he set the boxes down. "We've confirmed the DNA sample. Elian, he's your grandson, Oren." No one in the cabin spoke for a few seconds. Elian sat at the table, his eyes blinking briefly. He didn't seem confused. He just furrowed his brows a little. Then, very gently, very naturally, he looked toward Oren, his voice soft but firm. "Grandpa." Oren froze. He didn't turn his head or respond immediately. The air seemed to freeze for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Oren lifted his hand to cover his face. He cried. Not loudly, not wailing, just his shoulders trembling slightly, and the heavy sound of his breathing in the silence that even Branwen didn't break. Elian stood up slowly, walked over, and wrapped his little arms around Oren from the side. No words. And in that moment, what Oren had thought no longer existed came back, what was called family, not by paperwork, not by ceremony, but by the feeling that a life was leaning on him, not because it needed shelter, but because that was home. That afternoon, Oren sat with Elian on the porch steps, the two of them sipping hot cocoa. He told him about Nolan, the father Elian had never known. Simple stories. The time Nolan secretly poured gasoline into the model airplane's tank. The time they both failed at making an apple-picking machine from old plastic pipes. And the moment he saw the boy enter the workshop for the first time, wide-eyed but with a bright spark in his gaze. Elian didn't ask many questions. He just listened. Then, when Oren finished the story, Elian turned to him and gently said, "If my dad were still alive, he'd probably bake like you." Oren chuckled, the laughter breaking free like bubbles from a long, frozen stream. "Definitely," he said, then gently placed his hand on Elian's messy hair. "He'd be so proud of you." At that moment, Branwen stretched, moving closer to Oren, eyes gazing up, warm and deep like a lake at rest. Oren bent down, stroked the dog's head, and felt the connection between all three of them like inseparable links in a chain. That night, Oren opened the old notebook he had locked away in a drawer. Inside were notes for a project he had never completed, a mini robotic arm programmed to respond to the heartbeat of its controller. He crossed out the first line. This was Nolan's dream. Now it's the gift a grandfather gives to Elian. Branwen lay still beneath the table, breathing softly. Elian was fast asleep upstairs, the small light by his bed still glowing, casting a shadow on the picture he had just finished. A wooden house, an old man, a boy, and a dog with eyes like the morning sun. The cabin, deep in the forest, was no longer a place to hide. It had become a real home. That night, the wind howled stronger, the sky dotted with stars. Oren was sleeping in the armchair in the living room, the Remington close by, ready as if it were a part of his body. Upstairs, Elian was fast asleep. Branwen, however, was not sleeping. As usual, he lay close to the front door, eyes open, his ears always perked up like two antennae, his body coiled like a spring, waiting to spring into action. 1:13 raat ke samay. Branwen suddenly stood up. No barking, no growling, just a slight stretch. A breath held tight in his throat, and his eyes fixed straight toward the northern window, less than 15 meters away, where the edge of the pine forest hid enough foliage to conceal a person if they knew how to crouch low and move in rhythm. Branwen growled softly, just enough to startle Oren awake. With just a glance from Branwen, Oren understood. Tonight was different. He stretched his body, grabbed the gun, and quietly approached the door. On the touchscreen linked to the outside camera, 2 shadows flickered, moving fast, efficiently, all in black, masked, armed. One of them had reached the fence, hand reaching for a cutting tool. They weren't just here to scare. They were here to finish it. Oren didn't hesitate. He flipped the switch on the roof floodlight, sending a white beam sweeping across the clearing in front of the cabin. At the same time, he shouted, "Branwen!" No sooner had the words left his mouth than the dog shot through the door like a living arrow. No leash, no command, just instinct, and the determination forged in shadows no one dared to speak of. The confrontation took less than 2 minutes. The first man had barely crossed the fence when Branwen reached him from the side. He didn't jump immediately. Instead, he crawled low to the ground, then sprang just as the man lost his balance. A precise bite to his right arm made the intruder scream, his weapon falling to the ground. The next hit to the chest sent him crashing backward, unconscious after slamming his head into the base of a tree. The second man hesitated, trying to draw his weapon. But Oren was already waiting on the porch, the gun aimed straight at his chest. "Drop it!" Oren gritted out. The masked man stopped. But he didn't drop the gun. Branwen growled loudly, a growl not of an ordinary dog, but of a creature forged to survive hell, to fight when everything else had crumbled. The man hesitated. Just 1 second, enough for Oren to pull the trigger. Bang! The bullet skimmed past his wrist, knocking the gun out of his hand before he could fire. The man screamed, clutching his arm, then collapsed. Oren didn't kill, but he didn't let him go. By 2 a.m., Silas was there. The man was tied to the table leg, his mouth gagged, but his eyes were wide open, staring at Oren and Branwen, not with fear, but with the familiar gaze of those who had been programmed, indifferent, cold, and dangerous to the core. Silas removed the gag from the prisoner. The man stayed silent. Oren took a deep breath, then quietly said, "You came here to kill Branwen, didn't you?" He didn't answer directly. Then, he smiled. "Not just him," he said. "The orders were, eliminate the biological target. All of them." Oren felt his blood run cold. "The boy," Silas ground out. "They targeted Elian, too." He didn't deny it. "The objective is to erase any evidence linked to Protocol Noxus," he said, as if reading a report. "Any living being that could retain biological data must be eliminated. No distinction between animals or humans." Oren stepped closer, his gaze burning bright under the cabin's floodlight. "Then you go back and tell them, if they want to touch my grandson," he growled, "they'll have to walk over my dead body, and over his." He pointed to Branwen, who stood still, motionless, yet his eyes burned like fire. Branwen didn't need to growl anymore. The way he stood there, like an immovable stone, was the answer. Silas gestured for the security team to bind the prisoner tightly and take him to the interrogation center. Before leaving, he looked at Oren one last time. "They won't stop." Oren nodded slightly. "Neither will I." The morning light began to break as the convoy left the cabin. Oren remained sitting on the porch steps, his gun still at his side. Elian had woken up, sleepy-eyed, and walked down to sit beside him, resting his head lightly on his shoulder. Branwen lay at their feet, but his head was still turned toward the woods. The darkness had receded, but Branwen was still on guard. And in that brief moment of peace, Oren knew the war was far from over. But this family, a grandfather, a boy, and a dog carrying a biological code, would not yield. After the night of the encounter with the masked men, the cabin in the Elkhead mountain range became quieter than ever, but not the peace of rest. It was the quiet of preparation for the storms ahead. Branwen, though lightly injured from the scuffle, still stood firm in front of the cabin's front door, his eyes sharp as a lighthouse in the night. He didn't move from his position. As 6 months after the day little Lucy was declared dead, the German shepherd named Shadow still returned, without fail, each morning to the cemetery, quietly digging at the very spot where she had once been laid to rest. No one knew why. Not until 12 other dogs began arriving, one by one, forming what the town would come to call the 13. The silence in Willow's Edge was broken. A secret long buried was beginning to stir. But the question lingered in the fog. What was Shadow really digging for? Dawn in Willow's Edge wasn't like dawn anywhere else. The light didn't come fast, didn't rush to scatter the darkness. Instead, it crept in slowly, brushing hesitantly across the sagging porch rails, the dew-wet blades of grass, the flaking white fences, and the rotting wood that framed the front door of number 14 Clover Hill Road. And at that house, at exactly 5:12 in the morning, just as it had happened for the past 3 months, a soft sound echoed through the silence, the gentle scrape of claws on wooden floors, a single exhale like a sigh, and then a large black shadow moving soundlessly toward the back door. Shadow, the Miles family's German shepherd, stood still as stone, nose pressed against the glass pane, ears sharply angled forward as if listening to something no human ear could ever detect. One beat, then another, and when the hinges of the rear door gave the faintest creak, as if some invisible hand had nudged it from the other side, Shadow slipped through the narrow opening like a ghost, vanishing into the gray. No one in the house rose with him. No one except Jack Miles, the man with the tired posture of someone carrying years too heavy to name, and eyes that always seemed to search for something that wasn't there. Jack didn't stop Shadow. He didn't call out or try to bring him back. He only stood behind the curtain, barely visible, holding a mug of coffee long gone cold, watching the dog disappear into the mist as if witnessing a ritual, a silent farewell without words. Willow's Edge was a town tucked between a forest of pines and the mirrored stillness of Echo Lake. In spring, the dirt roads turned thick and sluggish. In summer, the air was stitched with crickets and the sweetness of wildflowers. But this year, no one noticed the seasons anymore. Since that one terrible day, time here had frozen in place, locked inside the moment Lucy Miles vanished beneath the dark, unmoving waters of Echo Lake. There was no body, no clear trace, just a lone sandal that washed ashore, and a scream. Someone claimed they heard it, high and sharp, like a thread snapping in the wind. The funeral was held with a closed white casket. Adults whispered things they couldn't say aloud. Children started fearing the lake more than any ghost story they'd ever known. And then there was Shadow. Shadow didn't go to the lake. He never returned to the place where Lucy was believed to have disappeared. Instead, each morning, he left home, past 3 rows of houses, a stretch of dirt road, and a low rise covered in pines, until he reached the old town cemetery, where Lucy was buried, or at least where her empty casket was placed. At first, folks thought it was just instinct, dogs mourning their lost owners, the kind of loyalty that made it into storybooks and news clips. But the behavior didn't fade with time. It became more focused, more deliberate. Shadow didn't just sit by the grave or howl like they did in legends. He dug. And it wasn't the erratic digging of boredom or some stray scent. It was precise, just one narrow strip of earth, about 2 hand spans wide, right at the foot of the stone marker that read, Lucy Ann Miles, 2015 to 2023. It was old Edith, the woman whose house stood closest to the cemetery, who first spoke about it. "That Miles dog," she muttered to her half-deaf husband. "He digs like he knows there's something down there folks missed." As the days wore on, more townspeople began to notice the ritual. They saw Shadow appear like clockwork, dig for a while, then sit, still as if waiting for an answer from below. Then he'd turn and head back, not in panic, not in sadness, but with a kind of quiet certainty, as if tomorrow he'd return at the same time to the same spot, to finish what no one else could understand. One fog-choked morning, Shadow arrived at the cemetery to find 2 men already waiting for him. One was old Marvin, the groundskeeper, gripping his shovel with suspicion in his eyes. The other was Sheriff Nolan Briggs, broad-shouldered, face shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, the kind of man who only lowered it further when things turned serious. "Shadow," Briggs said softly, his voice nearly swallowed by the mist. "What is it you're digging for down there?" Shadow gave no reply. Of course not, but his ears twitched. His nose hovered just above the soil he'd been working at for nearly 3 weeks now. Briggs stepped closer, stared down at the disturbed patch of earth. Nothing strange, just dirt. But what unsettled him wasn't the dirt. It was the feeling that whatever lay beneath might not want to stay buried much longer. And once it surfaced, the town would never be the same. Shadow left that day, as he always did, silent and sure. But Briggs stayed behind, one hand on his hip, the other shielding his eyes as he watched the dark silhouette fade into the pale gold of sunrise. He couldn't shake the feeling. Maybe it was the way Shadow looked at him. direct, unflinching. Or maybe it was the strange seed of belief that had begun to take root in his chest. That perhaps this dog was trying to say something no human had the courage to hear. And as Briggs finally turned to walk back toward his cruiser, something caught his eye in the northern tree line. A flicker, a faint movement, like a shadow slipping between the trees, too fast to make out, but enough to stop him cold. His hand instinctively brushed the handle of his holstered gun. He narrowed his eyes, let his hand fall back, but the unease remained, like a glowing ember buried beneath cold ash, waiting. At that same moment, on the other side of town, Jack Miles placed a hand gently against the photo of Lucy hanging in the hallway. For a fleeting second, his eyes didn't carry their usual weight. Instead, they held a trace of something else, like recognition, or the start of a connection he hadn't yet made. The picture showed Lucy on her 8th birthday, laughing in a yellow floral dress, her hair flying wild in the wind, and behind her, Shadow, as just a clumsy little pup, chasing to keep up with her steps. Something about the way Shadow looked at him this morning wouldn't leave Jack alone. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't longing. It was something far more urgent, a call for help, or a plea that couldn't be spoken. When Jack clipped on the leash that morning, Shadow didn't whine. He didn't resist. He simply held Jack's gaze, long, unwavering, before walking out the door like always. And in that moment, Jack felt it. Something cold traced the length of his spine, like the touch of truth just beginning to reach out. And now, as he stands beside the cemetery fence, he finds himself wondering whether he truly believes what people have long assigned to animals. The narrow intelligence, the mere instinct, the sadness that functions only as a reflex, or whether there might be something deeper, quieter, something that pulses just beneath the threshold of human understanding, beyond explanation, waiting to be seen. Shadow is there, as he is every morning, his front paws pressed firmly into the soil, shoulders hunched, that solid frame of his sinking slowly with each deliberate motion, like a living clock whose every movement carries the weight of something ancient and exact. The ground before the gravestone, bearing the name Lucy Ann Miles, has been disturbed again, nearly reaching the surface of the symbolic coffin. Not a container of flesh and bone, but of family relics buried to say goodbye to a child no longer there. "That's enough, Shadow," Jack calls out, his voice low but cutting through the early morning stillness. Shadow lifts his head, his muzzle caked with dirt, eyes narrowing against the sunlight. And in that gaze, there is something that feels like comprehension. There is no growl, no bark, only the steadfast refusal to break his gaze from the earth. Shadow stands still, panting, tongue just slightly out, and then, without hesitation, returns to the same spot, digging again, deeper now, harder, faster, as though something waits to be unearthed and might vanish forever if not reached in time. Briggs emerges from behind, his mud-caked boots pressing into the soft ground with a weighted sound. He steps up beside Jack, saying nothing at first, just following the line of Shadow's stare. And after a few moments, his voice drops low like gravel. "You see anything strange?" Jack's hands tighten in the pockets of his coat. "He's not digging randomly, Tom. He knows exactly where to dig, and he's done it for 3 months straight." "People say dogs remember their owners." Briggs replies, more to fill the silence than to argue, then lapses into quiet once more. It's not that he doesn't believe Jack. In truth, Briggs has already begun to see this entire thing through a different lens, no longer strictly as a cop, but as a father who once nearly lost a child to a similar kind of vanishing, many years ago. The first beams of sunlight pierce through the trees, casting themselves across the disturbed soil, lighting up a patch of earth that appears darker, subtly, unnaturally so, as if it had once been turned and hastily covered again. Shadow stops. He lowers his body to the ground, nose drawing in the scent with a sharp pull, then retreats a step, sitting back, his eyes locked onto that small, newly exposed patch of ground. Something has shifted. In the air, in Shadow's breath, even in the birdsong around the cemetery, which now seems to retreat and grow distant. Have you ever thought? Briggs turns to Jack, his gaze softer now, stripped of its usual hardness. That maybe that coffin was empty all along? Jack goes still. For the first time since losing Lucy, a thought he had buried deep and fought to silence claws its way back to the surface, clearer and more terrifying than before. It isn't the denial of loss. It's the possibility that the truth they were handed, the truth they lived with, was never the whole story to begin with. Suddenly, Shadow springs to his feet, nostrils flaring as though detecting something faint yet vital. He spins around and bolts towards the far end of the cemetery, where an old eucalyptus tree leans over part of the fence. Jack and Briggs both turn, but don't react in time. Then, from within the tall grass pressed up against the fence, there comes a strange sound, not loud, not distinct, just a soft, metallic click, like metal brushing against stone. Shadow lets out a low, growling note, then lowers his head and begins to claw furiously at a clump of grass, digging as if time itself were running out. Jack rushes forward. Briggs pulls out his phone. Behind Lucy's headstone, the morning sun catches something half buried in the soil, small, dull, but unmistakably familiar. It's a pendant in the shape of a leaf, the one Lucy always wore before she vanished, the one that should have been buried with her. Jack kneels, hands trembling, and picks up the dirt-streaked silver chain. Its floral engravings faded, but the maple leaf charm still perfectly intact, just like in the final photo of Lucy in the backyard, taken the day before she disappeared. There is a faint, earthy scent rising from the upturned soil, musty but strangely sweet under the sun, as if the ground where Shadow has been digging has kept something hidden, and is now revealing only the first piece. Briggs speaks into the phone, his voice gravel and command, not a single word wasted. He looks to Jack with a heaviness in his eyes. There's no need to say anything more. The only thing either of them knows for sure is this: something here is wrong, and that dog, somehow, has never been mistaken. But before they can think further, another sound drifts over, from beyond the low wooden fence, not a car, not the wind, but the subtle patter of claws against gravel, scattered and measured, coming from multiple directions. A pale yellow Labrador steps in first, calm, head slightly lowered, a crumpled plaid scarf around its neck. Then a gray husky follows, eyes distant, unfamiliar. Then a black and white border collie slips in silently from the left. Within minutes, they arrive, one by one, all breeds, all sizes, emerging from the winding trails around the town. 12 dogs, no leashes, no owners, no calls bringing them in. They gather around Lucy's grave as if drawn by a single invisible thread, not chaotic, not barking, but in a strange, synchronized silence. And at the center of the circle they form, Shadow lifts his head, gaze sweeping across each of them, each pair of eyes, each measured step, as though marking an unspoken rhythm that they all, somehow, already understand. Briggs steps back, hand grazing his coat. What the hell is happening? Jack doesn't answer. He is watching Shadow, and what he sees is no longer just a dog. It is something else entirely, a center, a signal, a leader who does not need to speak to be obeyed. No one gave a command. But at the exact same moment, all 13 dogs lowered their heads, not a single growl, not a bark, only the sound of paws beginning to move in unison, front limbs striking the ground with rhythmic precision, each clawed touch echoing like the ticking of a clock counting backward. The earth in front of Lucy's grave quickly transformed into a patch of torn soil and scattered roots, marked by muddy paw prints and flying blades of grass that caught the early light like pieces of a broken secret. Rumors moved faster than any attempt to contain them. By late afternoon, someone had already climbed the cemetery fence to record a video, and by the following day, the clip titled "The Greenwood 13" had exploded across social media, shared over 70,000 times beneath headlines like "Can Dogs Sense Souls?", "A Strange Premonition," and "13 Dogs and the Grave of a Missing Girl." People began gathering outside the cemetery every morning. Some brought bread, others held up phones to film. A few lit incense and whispered prayers into the wind. Children clung to their mothers' sleeves, their eyes wide with a blend of fear and fascination. And then, the elders began to murmur, softly at first, almost afraid to hear themselves speak, that this wasn't merely the grief of one loyal dog, but something far more ominous, a warning. They called them the 13. And soon, they believed this was no longer just the sorrow of the Miles family, but a sign hanging over all of Greenwood, a town where nothing had ever happened significant enough for the press to bother showing up. Until now. At the home of Old Man Hank, owner of a sweet-tempered Labrador, the flyer still fluttered on the post outside his porch. A notice put up 2 days earlier. Honey went missing at 3 a.m. The back door was locked. No one knows how she got out. A similar story unfolded at the Wright residence. Their husky, Luna, had never wandered at night. But that morning they found her kennel door wide open. No sign of forced entry, no barking heard during the night. And she was simply gone. By noon, there she was, in the now viral video, standing beside a massive German shepherd, her eyes glazed as if drawn into a trance. Every single one of them had once belonged to someone. Each had a name, a life within the comfort of wooden houses, backyards filled with flower beds or worn rugs, food bowls always brimming on schedule. But ever since Shadow began his silent pilgrimage each morning, they had one by one stepped out of their known routines, drawn not by any noise or signal, but by a calling no human ear could catch. And the strangest part, what shook even the skeptics, was that they only ever came at dawn. Not earlier, not later. Around 6:13 a.m., the precise moment Shadow passed through the gate, each one would appear, not scattered, but together, converging. They never attacked anyone, never chased, never begged. They only dug. In one place. One name. Lucy Ann Miles. Jack sat on the front porch steps, his fingers curled tightly around a silver necklace, newly cleaned, the soft amber of late afternoon sun reflecting off the metal until it looked like frozen tears. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Shadow had looked at him that morning. A look that felt knowing, urgent, like it carried an order that didn't come from any human voice. Sheriff Briggs returned to the cemetery just before nightfall. The earth in front of Lucy's headstone was now marked with countless indentations, deep claw furrows, where the topsoil had been scraped away to reveal the dense, dark brown of older dirt. Like something had once been disturbed there, then covered up again. He looked around. The pack had vanished as quietly as it had come. No rustle, no trace, only stillness. Only Shadow remained, sitting silently before the headstone, ears alert, eyes fixed toward the northern tree line. And just as Briggs turned to leave, he stopped, because for the second time in 3 days, he saw movement between the trees. This time, it wasn't a flicker of shadow or a hallucination born from failing light. It was real, something with weight, something breathing, something that cracked dry leaves beneath its feet. But by the time Briggs reached the fence, the space beyond it was silent again. thick with the kind of stillness that feels like fabric just beginning to stir in the wind. Only his heartbeat thudded in his ears, loud in a world that had gone eerily still. Elsewhere in the town, Elena Miles sat by a half-open window, the same window where Lucy used to sit with Shadow, reading aloud as light poured through the panes. Now, the golden haze of sunset stretched into the small bedroom, casting a honey-tinted wash over the faded blue walls where one picture still hung, the drawing Lucy had made for her mother. A large tree, a girl with curly hair standing beside a black dog, and behind them, a massive sun, perfectly round, its long rays stretching like fingers across the page. Elena was not someone who cried often. The tears had dried up long ago, during that first week, after the night she clutched Lucy's tiny sandal in the bathroom until dawn, waking to find her hair matted against the porcelain sink. But tonight, something was different. Not pain exactly, but a kind of aching ripple running through every layer of memory. Shadow had been a birthday surprise, a gift Lucy had never expected, especially since she'd never had a pet before. At first, Elena was worried. Retired canines didn't always adjust easily to family life, especially around children. But those fears dissolved within 3 days, the moment she saw Lucy sitting quietly beneath the old pear tree, doodling away while Shadow lay sprawled beside her, breathing softly, as if afraid to disturb the movement of her hand. And from that day forward, each afternoon was theirs, woven with a kind of companionship that felt ancient, as if the two had known each other long before this life. But what Elena remembered most clearly weren't those peaceful afternoons. It was the nights, the ones right before everything changed, when Lucy started whispering strange things in her sleep. The child would bury her face into Shadow's fur and mumble so softly that Elena had to lean in to catch fragments. "Someone's outside the door. I don't like that man. Don't let anyone find the bracelet." Once, Elena walked in to find Lucy asleep with her arms wrapped tight around Shadow's neck. And Shadow, who usually leapt up to greet her, tail wagging, didn't move. He simply looked at her, not with joy, but with tension in his eyes, lowering his head protectively over his chest, as if guarding something she couldn't see. Back then, Elena had brushed it off. Childish fear, canine instinct. She smiled, kissed Lucy's cheek, turned off the light. But now, standing in a room still soaked in yesterday's breath, every small detail returned with a quiet vengeance. Shadow had known. He'd sensed it. He had warned them. But no one had listened. Her hand grazed the soft lavender cloth on Lucy's desk. Her eyes caught on the corner of a notebook. She opened it. Another drawing. A small room with a narrow window and a dull yellow light. Unclear whether it was a bulb or the moon. In the corner, Lucy had drawn herself, hunched and faceless. Behind her, a large, dark shape loomed, tall, pointed, reaching a hand toward her neck like a shadow cast by someone standing too close. And suddenly, Elena realized this wasn't just grief. This wasn't just mystery. Something deeper was trying to be remembered, through 13 dogs, through an old photograph, through a child's crayon lines left unfinished. And at the corner of the page, Lucy had scrawled a few words in thick, uneven strokes, the lines slanted and untamed, as if written in haste or by a trembling hand. "Shadow won't let them touch me." A sudden breeze slipped through the slightly opened window, lifting a strand of hair from Elena's forehead, and she rose to her feet, heart racing, stepping out onto the porch with the notebook clutched tightly against her chest, the cold at the nape of her neck trailing like a whisper down her spine, something formless yet undeniably present. Out in the yard, the sky had already deepened into that particular shade of violet that only appears just before night truly begins, And there she saw Jack returning from the cemetery, his steps slow, head bowed, and Shadow, though always familiar with the way home, trailing behind today, not leading the path as he always did. But then, just as they neared the gate, Shadow stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't howl. He simply stood there, utterly still, his nose turned not to Jack, not to Elena, but to something behind her, to the room where Lucy used to sleep. Elena turned, following the invisible line of Shadow's gaze, and in that precise moment, from some place deep within her that words could never reach, she understood, with a clarity sharper than logic, that the dreams her daughter used to speak of, the strange murmurs in the night, might not have been dreams at all. And then it happened. The light in Lucy's room flickered on, though no one had touched the switch. It blinked off. Then on again. 3 times. Jack stepped up onto the porch, his eyes meeting Elena's, and in his hand was Lucy's necklace, the same one he had unearthed from the cemetery, the same one he hadn't let go of since dusk began to fall. The Miles family's wooden house stood hushed in the night, its aging roof catching the moonlight like a delicate wash of silver brushed on by an unsteady hand. And in the space where Shadow once lay each evening, guarding the porch with quiet loyalty, there was now only emptiness, for he had not slept by the steps since the earth at the cemetery began to stir. By morning, the town awoke not with the usual rhythm of small-town life, but with whispers growing louder by the hour. At the general store near the town center, the young clerk spoke of dogs, not just one, but a group, standing perfectly still at the junction near Greenwood Hill, their eyes fixed in unison on the old cemetery. At Loma's Cafe, debates flared about whether the state veterinary office should be notified or if a local containment group should be organized. And over at the police station, Briggs received more than 10 calls within the first 2 hours, most of them pleading, demanding, do something about the dogs, handle Shadow. Our kids are scared. A town meeting was called on short notice, held in the church hall beneath the faded green dome that had once been a backdrop to weddings, funerals, and countless high school graduations. But today, even the stained glass light could not soften the thickening air of fear that clung to every wooden pew. Briggs stood at the center of the room, his shirt tucked into worn jeans, arms crossed in a silent attempt to hold back the storm of voices coming at him from all directions. "I'm not saying dogs can see ghosts, but this has gone too damn far," growled Mr. Granger, the hardware store owner, his face red with both anger and something closer to dread. "They're on my lawn every night, just standing there. No howling, no barking, just staring at my wife's window like they're waiting for something." "I find it strange," said Mrs. Edith from the front row, her gaze locked with Briggs's, sharp and unwavering, "that no one is asking why they all chose the same grave, not 13 random spots, 13 times. The exact same one. We can't let the whole town be paralyzed by a pack of dogs." The voice of Dr. Helm, the town's vet, rang out, firm and cold as tempered steel. "Even if he's a trained service animal, Shadow's behavior is now beyond instinct. This is uncontrolled. If he's the alpha, then, professionally speaking, I recommend temporary sedation, or permanent removal." Silence fell. Not just quiet, but a vacuum of sound so complete it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Jack stood abruptly, the chair behind him clattering to the floor with a crack that echoed like a shot. "Shadow isn't crazy," he said, his voice firm, not angry, but filled with the ache of someone asking to be believed. "He's just doing what we're too afraid to do, seeking the truth." "He's a dog, Jack," Helm repeated, slowly now, like each word was a needle meant to pierce whatever resolve Jack still held. "And because he's a dog, he doesn't lie," Jack answered, his eyes locking on to Briggs, the only person in the room who had been there the moment Lucy's necklace was pulled from the earth. Elena stood quietly against the wall, Lucy's sketchbook clutched to her chest, her silence more eloquent than any argument, her gaze a mirror reflecting all the doubts that had begun to unravel in every heart present. A few people began to nod. Some furrowed brows softened. Not everyone believed. But for the first time, someone was truly listening. Briggs exhaled deeply, lifting one hand in a calming gesture toward the room. I know everyone's scared, but before we decide anything final, I'm going to keep watching Shadow. And I need one more day. One day, he repeated, eyes sweeping across the faces before him, searching not for approval, but for the last fragile strands of belief that might still hold. The meeting dissolved, not in agreement, but in the heavy hush of reluctant acceptance. One by one, the townspeople left, their footsteps slow, weighted, fading across the cool tile of the church floor. As the hall emptied, Briggs stepped beside Jack. I'll come by your place tonight, he said, low enough for only him to hear. There's something I need to show you. Jack nodded. Elena came to his side, resting a hand on his shoulder, but her eyes were drawn elsewhere, to the stained glass window where an angel with a sword stood etched in colored light. And on that glass, faint, almost invisible unless you looked closely, was the smudge of a dog's nose, left behind the day before when Shadow had charged to that very spot and stood beneath it for 10 full minutes, unmoving, for reasons no one could explain. Nightfall came sooner than forecast, and the rain began to fall. Thin, almost imperceptible, like breath passing through the leaves. In his study, Briggs stood before the mirror, holding a freshly developed photograph in his hand. It showed the patch of earth in front of Lucy's grave, captured with an infrared camera. Nothing distinct, only a darker region, a subtle shape beneath the surface, like something long buried yet restless. But there, in the lower corner of the image, barely visible and shrouded in grain, was something that should not have been there, something no report had ever mentioned. The rounded curve of what looked unmistakably like a fingertip, half hidden in soil. Small, pale, human, and entirely unaccounted for. Briggs turned towards the calendar on the wall. Tomorrow would mark exactly 3 months since the funeral. And according to the latest message from the weather station, a heavier than usual fog was expected to roll in by dawn. In a town like Willow's Edge, where everything revolved around 3 main streets, a single elementary school, 2 corner stores, and a bar that never stayed open past 10, any change, no matter how subtle, had the power to send ripples outward, slow but deep, sometimes strong enough to loosen the soil around things that had long been buried and long forgotten. That morning, as the mist blanketed the streets like a thick shroud cast over the town's waking breath, a silver-gray vehicle glided in silently from the north, its tires whispering across the damp gravel without so much as a protest. Behind the wheel sat a woman, slender frame, chestnut hair tied high, eyes sharp and still like the surface of a lake the moment before the first stone breaks it. Detective Mara Quinn of the Federal Investigative Unit had been dispatched on direct request from the governor's office after the now infamous footage of the Greenwood 13 reached the screen of a government advisor whose own daughter had disappeared under eerily similar circumstances in another state. She brought little with her: a small suitcase, a folder bag heavy with case files, and a blue ink pen with a cracked cap. Quinn was not one for theatrics. She came to do the one thing she was uncommonly good at: finding the cracks in stories that others believed were seamless. At the local police station, Briggs greeted her with a firm handshake, his eyes caught somewhere between exhaustion and a flicker of relief. They sat in a modest meeting room where the walls were stitched with notes, hand-drawn timelines, and photographs of Lucy Miles pinned at the center, her smile vivid and haunting, as if she were still watching, silently urging them to piece together the shattered mosaic of her last days. "There's one person, the only witness to have seen Lucy that day," Briggs began, voice level, worn. "Paul Jenner, but he left town a week after the funeral. Said he was moving back to care for a sick mother." "No forwarding address?" Quinn asked, eyes unmoving from the file. "Just a temporary registration. The phone number he left doesn't work anymore." "Rental paperwork?" "Forged." Briggs paused, the silence behind the word deeper than expected. "No one's ever met his mother." Quinn placed her pen on the table, tapped once. "At the time of Lucy's disappearance, he was the first to report it?" "Yeah. Said he saw her walking toward the lake. Even pointed to the exact spot where the sandal was found." She tilted her head, her voice soft but clear. "Don't you find that strange? A man new to town, working a job that doesn't require much interaction, yet just happens to be there, at the precise moment, with a story that sounds perfectly designed to close the book before it ever fully opens." Briggs didn't answer. He simply slid a photograph across the table. Jenner, standing in the crowd during the funeral, his face expressionless, almost misplaced among the grieving, his eyes locked on the casket, not bowed in mourning, not wet with tears, more like he was checking, with a cold kind of certainty, that something had been finalized. Quinn jotted a brief note, then rose to her feet. "I want to see where he lived," she said. Briggs nodded without hesitation. Jenner's former rental sat at the far end of Cypress Street, a tired two-story wooden house with sunburnt red tiles flaking from the roof, and a front porch missing one leg from its bench. The locks had been changed, but Briggs still had the old key from the landlord. When the door creaked open, a layer of dust greeted them, but the space didn't feel truly abandoned. It felt like a room paused in the middle of something, like it had been left, but not willingly. Quinn stepped slowly, eyes scanning each faint shoeprint on the floor. Her gaze swept the dim living room, pausing at the kitchen counter, where a photo frame sat face down against the wall. She turned it over. Briggs froze. Inside the frame was a picture of a small, blonde-haired girl, slight in stature, standing beside a man wearing dark sunglasses, his face partially obscured, but the sharp jawline, the nose bridge, and the curve of his lips matched perfectly with the file photo of Paul Jenner. Quinn stared at the girl's face, blurred but eerily familiar. Without a word, she slid the frame carefully into her file bag, then moved toward the staircase. At the end of the upstairs hallway, a door remained shut. Its handle was scratched, deep grooves like it had once been gripped hard, possibly in fear. As she opened it, dust swirled like smoke into the stale air. In the corner, a folding bed was pressed against the wall, its surface sunken, like someone had sat there for a very long time. Near the window, a small desk held a tin box. Inside it, a lavender hairband, the exact style sold at the accessory shop near Lucy's school. Quinn lifted the band gently, passed it to Briggs, her voice falling to a near whisper. "This model was exclusive to second graders at Pine Grove Public. They only made 10, each in a unique color." Briggs didn't ask. He didn't need to. They both knew. This was no coincidence. It couldn't be. On the drive back, the fog finally began to lift, revealing slices of blue sky for the first time in days. As the car passed Greenwood Cemetery, Quinn raised a hand. Briggs slowed. She stepped out. The earth was still damp beneath her shoes. She walked slowly toward the stone marked Lucy Miles. Shadow was already there, as he always was, but this time he wasn't sitting. He wasn't digging. He stood, still, tense. His muzzle pointed toward the northern tree line, where the leaves trembled. not with the breeze, but in a rhythm that didn't match the rest of the woods, a rhythm out of place, like a whisper off-key in a silent room. Just as Quinn reached Briggs's shoulder, her phone buzzed. A message from the federal office. No record of a Paul Jenner exists in any state residential database. The air held still, suspended, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to breathe. Quinn folded her phone shut with a quiet snap, her eyes fixed on the edge of the forest ahead, where the tree line blurred gently beneath a creeping veil of mist, like the curtain of a stage just beginning to lift, revealing the next scene of a play too haunting for anyone to name aloud. And then, from afar, came the sound, familiar, yet altered by the morning, the tapping of claws against stone, the scattered rhythm of padded feet on gravel, the breathless, unified cadence of a run that was neither rushed nor aimless, but steady, purposeful, imbued with the kind of synchronicity only a chorus that has never needed a conductor can achieve. The 13 had returned. Shadow didn't turn, didn't flinch, but the moment the first Labrador crossed the cemetery fence, a flicker passed through his gaze. Not surprise, not command, but something instinctual, primal, like an order passed down through the marrow of generations. One by one, they came, each stepping onto the worn patch of earth before Lucy's grave, a place long disturbed but never fully uncovered. And today, for the first time, no one tried to stop them. The makeshift fence had no sentries, no authority standing watch, for the townspeople had retreated after Briggs's appeal the night before. That they needed more time, just one morning more, to listen to what the dog was trying to say in the only language it knew. And at exactly 6:17 a.m., as the first beam of sunlight pierced the curtain of fog, the entire pack began to dig. Not chaotically, not frantically, but with a calm and eerie order, as if the motion had been rehearsed in dreams passed between creatures who could not speak. Soil lifted in smooth arcs, roots snapped, stones rolled aside, and at the center of it all, Shadow dug harder, deeper, with a drive so intense his muscles trembled with tension, his entire body caked in dark, wet earth, and yet his eyes, steady, unblinking, never left the spot before him, as if sight alone could summon the truth. Briggs stepped back, fingers gripping the edge of the thermal photo, the one with the strange undulation barely visible beneath the grave's surface, while Quinn stood still, neither speaking nor taking notes, not even raising her camera, because something in her recognized that this moment was not meant to be captured, only carried, engraved into a part of memory deeper than any evidence could ever reach. The sound of claws digging echoed all the way to the edge of the woods. And then, a howl, not long, not loud, but enough to silence the entire scene. A bulldog barked once, short, sharp, and stepped back. A husky followed, retreating with equal solemnity. A patch of earth now lay open, wide, clear, disturbed, and from its center, precisely where Shadow had broken through the final layer, a corner of something pale emerged, box-shaped, wood, whitewashed, edged in silver. A coffin's corner. Quinn stepped forward slowly, her hand reaching down to touch the wood, feeling the damp and the chill that rose from the soil, the kind of cold that belongs to ground never allowed to rest. She looked at Briggs, and no words were necessary. Briggs pulled out his phone and made a single call. No discussion followed. A temporary lockdown was declared within 10 minutes. Yellow tape was strung wide around the area. But no one approached the dogs. No one dared. And then Elena appeared. No one had summoned her. No one had sent word. And yet there she stood, within the soft haze of morning mist, her long dress soaked at the hem, her loosely tied hair wild with wind, her eyes holding the stillness of someone who had always known, from the beginning, that this day would come. but had only now found the strength to walk into the heart of her grief. She saw Shadow, his entire body coated in mud, seated beside the freshly revealed coffin's edge, head bowed, ears drooped, like a sentinel who had just completed the final watch of a long, sleepless night. Elena moved closer, slow and steady, and then lowered herself to the ground without hesitation, without fear of dirt or ceremony, and reached out, placing a gentle hand atop the dog's head. And Shadow didn't move, didn't flinch, only closed his eyes, as if, in that moment, he had finally touched the thing he'd been waiting for across 3 long, relentless months. "We have to open it," she said, her voice so low she barely heard it herself. But Briggs understood. By midday, the forensics team had arrived. Procedures were paused in favor of site verification. Quinn signed the temporary exhumation order, with the rare agreement of all 3 necessary parties: the family, the police, and the federal witness. A wide circle of observers gathered as the technical team began to lift the lid of the coffin. The wood creaked dryly. Nails snapped one by one. The lid came free. No gasps, no cries, only a sudden stillness so full it seemed to erase all other sound. Inside the coffin was nothing. No body, no belongings, no cloth. Only the faded velvet lining, dulled by time, torn at one corner, revealing bare wood beneath, cold, hard, and utterly empty. Elena collapsed. Jack caught her, arms locking around her as if trying to hold together a world that was fracturing under the weight of too many unspoken fears. Shadow didn't howl. He didn't whimper. He only stood and stared, not sad, not angry, not shocked, but with the stillness of one who had always known. Quinn stared into the hollow space for a long time. Then she bent lower, eyes scanning the torn fabric, stopping at a detail, a small, nearly invisible slit along the velvet's edge. She reached in and pulled out a scrap of paper, damp and ink-stained, the words smeared, except for 2 lines, still legible. "Don't stop digging." She's still listening. A breeze rose, soft and tentative, drifting across the open grave, lifting the thin layer of dust that had settled, as if trying to cover the truth again just after it had been revealed. Around the clearing, silence held, so deep they could hear the dry rustle of grass against pants' legs, the tight, shallow breathing of townsfolk standing at a distance, and the faint clicking of Shadow's claws tapping gently against the edge of the coffin. He stood there, his legs caked in dirt, his muzzle stained with dried flecks of blood where roots had split his skin, and yet his eyes still clear, still fixed on the empty space inside, as if that void itself were the final key to something humans had not yet dared to look directly in the face. Briggs stood beside Elena and Jack, his face no longer wearing the mask of authority, no longer the rigid mask of law, but the solemn expression of a man who had just witnessed a ritual far beyond the bounds of reason. In all his years, he had opened coffins in search of evidence, but never had one left his heart clenched in this way. Not because it was empty, but because everything that should have been there was gone. The bracelet, the lavender ribbon, the family photograph, the tiny stuffed bear Lucy used to cling to every night before bed. All of it, claimed to have been buried with her. But now none of it could be found. And the most important thing of all, there was no body, no Lucy. From the crowd behind the caution tape, an elderly man seated in a wheelchair trembled as he tugged his wool cap lower over his brow, eyes fixed unwaveringly on Shadow. A young mother held her infant close, one hand hurriedly pulling out her phone to capture the unfolding scene. And the children, none of them laughed, none dared to fidget or whisper. They stood frozen, as if turned to stone, eyes wide and unblinking, transfixed by the eerie, flickering glow rising from the raw, unfinished trenches of dirt. Quinn handed Briggs a small, creased note. He read it slowly, his lips tightening with every word, then turned to her, his voice a breath above silence, meant for no one beyond their shadow. "You think Lucy?" "She's alive," Quinn said without a single heartbeat of hesitation. "Someone orchestrated this, intentionally, and they want us to keep looking." Elena reached out, her fingertips tracing along the cold edge of the casket, skimming the wood like she was trying to rediscover the seam of a memory someone had stitched shut in haste. "I used to feel like Lucy was still out there somewhere," she whispered, "but I was always afraid that if I believed it too much, I'd never survive." "It's because you believed," Quinn murmured, her voice soft as breath but anchored in something stronger than comfort, "that she's still listening." A sudden gust of wind snapped through the makeshift canopy overhead, tearing one corner loose. A few people startled and stepped back in alarm. But Shadow didn't flinch. He raised his head, inhaled deeply, and slowly turned toward the forest's edge, toward the grove of ancient oaks where the trees arched like weathered columns of some forgotten cathedral, where sunlight never touched the ground, and only the mingled breath of mist and wind moved freely between the trunks. And then he howled. Not long, not mournful, but deep, resonant, just enough to pull every ear into stillness, just enough to feel like a message, a chime marking the end of disbelief, the beginning of the next chapter, not of asking if Lucy was alive, but who took her, why they left these traces, and what it meant that everything had been staged just clearly enough for someone to find. Briggs grabbed his radio, his voice sharp, urgent now, ordering a perimeter lockdown of the northern woods and dispatching a team to begin searching the surrounding terrain. Old cabins, collapsed storage barns, any structure that could have been long abandoned or carefully hidden. But before he could give out detailed coordinates, Quinn was already gone, striding toward the dirt path that veered into the trees, her eyes locked on the trail of flattened grass, a narrow, winding indentation through the brush, as though something had passed over it again and again. "Has anyone ever searched the hill behind the cemetery?" she asked, not looking back. Briggs shook his head. Quinn paused beneath a towering maple, the late sunlight spilling in streaks across the shoulders of her dark leather jacket, her boots pressing softly into the moss-covered floor as she stepped between roots that twisted like veins beneath the earth. Shadow led the way, unleashed, unspoken to, unwavering. And behind them the others followed, the pack moving not as a frenzy, but as something solemn and ancient, like silent pilgrims crossing into sacred ground, into a place where truth didn't require permission to exist. And there, buried in the deepest hollow beneath the canopy, where no sunlight pierced, where the wind dared not pass through the thick barricade of branches, Quinn stopped. Something white protruded faintly from between the roots. A scrap of cloth, mud-soaked, trimmed with the faint thread of pale purple. She crouched slowly, lifted the edge of the fabric with careful fingers. Her gaze stayed fixed on the tree line ahead, afraid that if she blinked, this fragile thread of truth might dissolve back into shadow like a dream unfinished. A piece of a dress, a child's school uniform, a design issued only to students of Pine Grove Elementary. Shadow stood beside her, his ears angled, catching something far beyond the range of sound, a hum beneath the world's noise, a memory too old to speak, a presence too soft to name, something that lived between the decay of roots and the cool weight of untouched soil. Meanwhile, on the other side of the woods, Jack parked his truck at the edge of a wide field that sloped down into their backyard, where Lucy used to play beneath the massive oak, alone, but always laughing. No one had called him, no text, no knock at the door, but at 4:30 a.m., he'd opened his eyes to find Shadow sitting by the porch, silent, motionless, not wagging his tail, not even blinking, just watching him with eyes full of a need too profound to be ignored. Without hesitation, he had followed. They crossed through the old wooden fence, past waist-high ferns, until Shadow veered left, into a narrow trail Jack didn't recognize, despite having lived his entire life in this very town. The path was just wide enough for one person to duck under vines, winding through damp stone walls and tangled roots that grew like living riddles. But Shadow never hesitated, never slowed. When they finally stopped, Jack realized where they were. The stream. The one Lucy loved to sit by and paint fish with her watercolor pens. Only now, the clearing looked different. The earth had been disturbed. Fresh, dark clumps of soil turned upward, like something had been recently buried. There was no foul smell, no sign of a dead animal. But the air? The air held a pressure that made the hairs on his neck rise, a tension that whispered, "You're close." Shadow lowered his head and scraped the leaf-covered dirt. Just a few strokes, and something glinted. Plastic, circular, small. A keychain? Numbered. Jack dropped to his knees, brushed the soil with shaking fingers, and pulled it out. A bracelet, pale pink. Plastic beads spelling out 5 letters. Lucy. The C was scratched, but still clear. This was the bracelet. The one Elena had placed on Lucy's wrist in the coffin. The last birthday gift their daughter ever received. The one no one else had touched. The one that should never have been here. And now it was here, not in the grave, but in the forest. Not beside a body, but lying quietly in the very place that had once been her favorite to play, where her laughter had once tangled in the branches, and her footprints had softened the soil with the lightness only a child's joy could leave behind. Jack sat down slowly, the bracelet still clutched in his hand, but his eyes were no longer fixed on the ground, no longer searching the dirt for truth. Instead, they lifted quietly to the dense canopy above, where the early sunlight pierced through the thinnest gaps between the leaves, casting radiant dots of gold across the shadows, like 100 watchful eyes silently observing from above. Shadow sat beside him, back straight, head slightly tilted, gaze unwavering toward the clearing near the stream's edge, posture still and alert, as if bracing for something only he could sense. Someone had been here, not an animal, not chance. This was no accident. And if the bracelet had been placed back here, not lost, not dropped, but returned, then it had been kept, preserved through the 3 long months, hidden with care. Which meant someone hadn't merely taken Lucy's body, but had orchestrated a false burial, a mock ritual of death, an empty coffin, a fabricated ending, a veil drawn carefully over a truth known only to someone who understood every detail intimately, with chilling precision. Quinn arrived nearly 30 minutes later, after receiving Briggs's urgent call. She said nothing when she saw Jack and Shadow waiting. She simply looked down at the bracelet in his hand, exhaled slowly, a breath long and quiet, like the soft click of a latch lifting on a door that hadn't opened in years. "We need to do this at the lake," she said finally, her voice low. Jack turned toward her, confused. "The lake? There's something I want to try," she continued. "If the drowning was a lie, then the person who staged it might have left something there, something to anchor the deception, a distraction, a planted clue meant to make everyone believe Lucy died, without ever needing to prove it." They returned to Echo Lake that afternoon, when the surface of the water was so still it looked like a pane of glass laid delicately between the arms of the forest. Quinn walked slowly along the shoreline, eyes scanning each tree root, each clump of wild grass, until she stopped at a small patch of damp soil right at the water's edge, where a single set of footprints remained, recent, delicate, far too small to belong to any adult. She knelt down, took out a vial of chemical reagent meant for detecting dried blood. When the liquid hit the soil, nothing happened at first. But then, faintly, like ink dissolving in water, a thin line of violet blue emerged, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. Shadow approached, sniffing rapidly, pulling the scent into his memory. Then, without warning, he bolted, veering sharply into the woods northeast of the lake. Jack called out after him, but Shadow didn't slow, didn't look back. "Follow him," Quinn said simply. They ran, through rows of tall pines, over a trail thick with fallen needles and silence, until they reached a low, shadowed hollow, where the light dimmed to dusk even in daylight, and the wind came not from above, but from below, rising like breath from a space wider than the trees would suggest. Shadow stopped, standing before a massive moss-covered stone, at the base of which ran a narrow horizontal crack. Quinn crouched, switching on her flashlight and directing the beam into the darkness. There, beneath the stone, a cavity, just large enough for a child to crawl inside. The interior showed signs of pressure, of presence. The earth pressed flat, shaped in the vague contours of a body having once lain there. And in the far corner, crumpled but unmistakable, was a pale blue handkerchief, embroidered with the initials E.M., Elena Miles, the mother who had stitched her name into every item Lucy took to school, so nothing would get lost. There was no blood, no body, only traces, signs of someone having remained, and an odd scent, faint but distinct, not foul, not rotting, but warm, like the ghost of a breath left behind, the scent of a space that had held warmth and fear, and the desperate hope that someone might still come. Quinn drew back slowly, her gaze fixed on the fissure. "No one hit a body here," she whispered. "Someone hit a child." Jack said nothing. He stood still, breath heavy, pressing down on his chest like stone. Shadow sat again, eyes locked on the dark behind the rock, not barking, not growling, just watching, with that same steady intensity that suggested he saw something the others could not. And then, from that darkness, a breeze stirred outward again. And with it, a small scrap of torn paper drifted gently into the light, fluttering down to land at Quinn's feet. She picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, clumsy, but the words were clear. "I heard them. They said my name." In the chill air of that hollow, where Lucy's presence clung to the soil like dust never quite swept away, the message was not merely a note, it was proof that someone had been here, that someone might still be trying to reach them. Quinn's fingers tightened on the paper, her hand trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just read. Because in the uneven strokes of that fading ink, she didn't just read a message from the lost, she read life. Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl, not in warning but in insistence, then turned sharply and took off again, darting through the mist-wet branches like a command carried by wind. Quinn didn't wait. She and Jack followed, crashing through the trees, racing past the drooping limbs heavy with dew, as though the forest itself were lifting its curtain for the final act of a story long buried beneath silence. By evening, Quinn returned to the station, the pale amber of sunset casting a quiet glow across the towering stacks of case files that walled her desk like a fortress built from years of unanswered questions. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began cross-referencing names, dates, disappearances, and the drownings with no recovered bodies. Lucy's wasn't the first. 4 years ago, an 8-year-old boy named Hayden Ross vanished after reportedly getting lost near Cedar Lake, just 10 miles from Greenwood. No body was found, but his shoes had been discovered less than 30 feet from the water's edge, dry. No sign of water, no mud. Clean. 5 years ago, a 9-year-old girl named Amira Lang was said to have fallen from an old wooden dock at Echo Lake while playing with an uncle visiting from out of state. That uncle was never seen again. The official report noted, "With no body recovered, cause of death cannot be confirmed." The bracelet, the lavender ribbon, the family photo, the tiny stuffed bear that Lucy once held to her chest every night before drifting off to sleep. All of them had been said, declared even, to have been placed inside the coffin. But now, not one of them remained. And above all else, what truly mattered most, there was no body. There was no Lucy. Quinn's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, each letter tapped with silent determination as she entered the name Paul J. into the federal database, initiating a deep scan through 7 years' worth of temporary residency filings within a 30-mile radius of Greenwood. 3 separate entries surfaced, each under the name Paul, each sharing the same year of birth, yet none bearing matching documents, photos, or residential details. It was the unmistakable trail of a man who had changed his identity more than once. And each appearance aligned eerily with the timeline of missing children. Cases scattered across counties, always too isolated to connect. Until now. She stared at the screen, the overlapping data forming like veins on a hidden map, a web of truths buried beneath time and anonymity. But now, with each blinking light, a thread began to glow, and something ancient stirred in Quinn's mind, something not taught by training nor governed by software, a human instinct for recognizing patterns where others only saw coincidence. The next morning, Shadow had already vanished by the time Jack awoke. No leash, no handler, no direction, just a quiet pull, like a magnetic line drawn between memory and purpose, tugging Jack toward the overgrown lot behind the old post office, a plot that once held a brick factory, long shuttered and forgotten. When Jack arrived, the rusted door of the warehouse stood ajar. Thick layers of dust blanketed the floor, but across it, clearly and undeniably, were paw prints, clean and fresh, carving a single purposeful trail into the building's shadowed interior, where daylight only slipped through in fractured beams from a broken shutter above. And there, near the far wall, stood Shadow. Head low, nose pressed to the cracked tile floor, as though something just beneath the surface whispered to his senses while still evading human sight. Jack approached slowly. Shadow stepped aside, half a pace, offering a clear line of vision. That's when he saw it. A dried speck of blood, small as a raindrop, and beside it, a pink hair clip. The exact kind Elena used to fasten Lucy's hair before school. There was no dust on the clip, no cobweb near the stain. It was all recent. Quinn arrived within 15 minutes. She crouched beside the clip, her expression darkening as if some long idle machine in her mind had just been restarted. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the surrounding walls until she stopped at a rectangular patch, faint but noticeable, where paint had peeled away in cleaner lines than the surrounding decay. "There was a camera here?" she murmured. "This place hasn't had power in years," Jack said, his voice uneasy. "Exactly," Quinn replied, her voice narrowing into focus. "If someone went through the trouble of installing a camera in a place like this, it wasn't for security. It was because they didn't want to be seen, but they needed to see." She stepped back into the sunlight, which now pierced the thick morning mist like a quiet flame through gauze. "This wasn't a prison," she said softly. "It was a vantage point." Shadow moved beside her, his eyes tracking the dirt like he was reading a language written in footsteps, in scent, in memory, following a trail not of accident, but design. For the remainder of the afternoon, Quinn, Jack, and Shadow were drawn, without hesitation, to 3 other locations across town: a thicket near the roadside, where someone had last seen Lucy, a stretch of broken fencing behind her old teacher's house, and a shallow patch of disturbed soil beneath a maple tree behind the auto repair shop. Each spot yielded something: a torn scrap of notebook paper, a single lost button, thin, almost invisible scratches across bark or stone. But the most haunting thing they all shared, what bound them unmistakably together, was the scent. A faint trace of lavender shampoo, the exact kind Lucy had always used, barely perceptible yet distinctly present, as if time itself had preserved the memory in the air. By sunset, the last light fell across Jack's shoulders as he stood at the front steps of their home, his fingers clenched tightly around the hair clip. Elena emerged without a word. Her eyes were red but dry, no tears left to fall. "Someone once told her," Jack said quietly, "about how death doesn't always need a body. Maybe it was him, planting that idea so she'd believe it when it was time to vanish." "Or maybe," Elena answered, her voice slipping through the cracks of something she hadn't yet dared to say aloud. "He wanted her to believe that if someone truly remembered her, they would never stop looking." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him from behind, and for a long moment they stood there in silence. On the porch, Shadow didn't move. His ears twitched once, then his head turned sharply toward the forest, toward the northern boundary, where the first portable searchlights had begun to hum into life, casting pale beams across the tree line in preparation for the morning's sweep. And then Shadow howled. For the first time that day, not drawn out, not mournful, but sharp, clear, and loud enough to echo down the valley like a flare sent skyward. Far across the western ridge, in a house left abandoned for nearly 3 years, a single warm light flickered on. The light wasn't harsh. It wasn't strange. It had the golden tone of a kitchen lamp on a cold evening, the kind of soft glow a child needs beside their bed to keep the shadows at bay. But that very normalcy, that calm, domestic stillness, was what sent fear creeping deeper than any crash or scream ever could. Because no one had entered that house in years, no one had seen movement behind its cracked windows, and no one, not a single soul, had imagined that someone, somewhere, could be living beneath such ordinary light after the world had declared them gone. The sky was heavy with fog the next morning, clouds clinging low to the hillside like wool soaked in silence. Quinn, Jack, Briggs, and 2 local deputies followed Shadow, who walked, not fast, not slow, but with a steadiness that spoke of knowing. Each step deliberate, each direction chosen. As though he had memorized this route not in maps, but in feeling, in grief, in the shape of every moment since Lucy vanished. The house stood at the edge of Blacktail Lake, its back pressed to the dense pine forest, its front staring into waters so still they mirrored the sky. The siding had faded to a weary gray. The roof was mottled, chipped, moss trailing down the seams, windows sealed with newspapers, some stuffed with rags, not a sound from within, not a stir of animal life. But Shadow inhaled deeply and charged forward, straight to the front door, where the wood had been clawed, upward, from the ground, long curved gouges running toward the lock, like someone had tried again and again to escape. Shadow backed up, braced himself, then lunged. The door blew open. Inside, the air held a scent that was at once immediate and overwhelming, a mingling of damp earth, worn fabric, and powdered milk. A smell so familiar it didn't need to be named, evoking the stillness of a child's bedroom, the kind of quiet that clings to the sleeves of forgotten clothes, the stitched ears of stuffed animals, the crumpled edges of coloring books filled too often and pressed under small hands searching for comfort. Jack was the first to step inside. He froze at the threshold, as though something had brushed against his chest. Not a hand, but a memory. In the corner of the room stood a single bed, dressed in pale blue sheets printed with dolphins and bubbles, a design discontinued nearly 4 years ago. Resting neatly at the center was a gray teddy bear, one ear torn, its left eye sewn back with red thread. The very same bear Lucy held in her arms in the photograph from her last birthday. Quinn moved toward the small desk beside the window. One drawer was locked, but everything on the surface had been arranged with unnerving precision. 3 coloring books aligned side by side, 2 unsharpened pencils laid parallel, and 1 notebook with a soft, worn cover. She opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's, wobbly uppercase letters leaning this way and that. It rained today, but they wouldn't let me go outside. I miss home. Will Cousin Shadow come here too? Briggs kept one hand pressed against the firearm at his hip, even though he knew, logically, there was no one left inside. But every object in that room was telling a story louder than any scream, a story real, raw, and stretching across not just 3 months, but perhaps years. Quinn opened the cupboard under the desk. A tin of powdered milk, half full, a soft package of sponge cakes, expiration date still valid, a plastic water bottle lying on its side, the label smudged by a set of tiny fingerprints. With tweezers, she extracted one more item, a used cooling patch, the kind mothers press to a fevered forehead, still faintly scented with mint. Each object spoke of care, but a kind of care meant to remain hidden, secret, and never discovered. In the adjacent room, they found a wooden cabinet with its latch unfastened. When they opened it, the air seemed to pause, the entire house inhaling all at once. Inside were files, thin folders marked in handwriting on adhesive strips at the corner. Hayden Ross, Cedar Lake, 2019. Amira Lang, Echo Shore, 2018. Lucy Miles, Greenwood, 2023. Each contained photos, medical notes, fragments of old school records. And in Lucy's file, one printed image, color, grainy, taken from behind. A little girl standing before a glass door, hair in twin braids, gray coat, red boots. The timestamp was clear. January 3rd, 2:43 p.m., 11 days after the funeral. Elena received the call the moment Quinn pressed the dial. She went still as Jack's voice reached her. No explanations, no questions, just 2 quiet words. She's here. She ran, no coat, no car, just the heart that had been crushed beneath 3 months of doubt and one unrelenting question whispered night after night. If Lucy's alive, why hasn't she come home? In that house, where every corner still held the warmth of a child's presence, Shadow lay curled beside the small pillow on the bed, his head resting against the wooden frame, eyes closed, as though, at last, he had reached what he'd been seeking for all those endless nights, while the world refused to believe him. But while the others slowly stepped back, stunned by what they had seen and shaken by what they had almost dared not hope, Quinn remained at the edge of the house, unmoving, in front of a small door tucked behind the kitchen, a narrow frame leading downward into darkness. She bent slowly, fingers brushing the worn wood of the handle, and turned it. The door creaked open. The scent that rose from the basement was thick and old, the breath of secrets long buried, secrets soaked in damp moss and mold, in silence and planning and pain. Her first footstep echoed with a dry, hollow note, like a sound thrown down a well. In the beam of her flashlight, the basement walls revealed themselves in rough stone, scored with uneven grooves, some carved, some scraped, some covered hastily with overlapping pages of newspaper pasted against the concrete as makeshift soundproofing. And in the furthest corner, tucked tight against the wall, sat a wooden desk. Scattered across it, folders, photographs, maps speckled with red pins, and forged identification papers. Children's names, children's faces, medical records, height notations, weight estimates, all labeled, sorted, pinned down as if these children were specimens, catalogued, not cherished. Lucy wasn't just a victim. She had been chosen. Quinn ran her fingers over the folders, one by one, until she found it, a thick file marked in red pen, the handwriting frantic but legible. Special case, retains visual recall, no contact with Group A or D, do not expose to daylight greater than 15 minutes per day. She turned the page. A photo of Lucy, seated before a small screen, hands holding a third-grade workbook. Dim overhead light cast long shadows across her features. There were no chains, no bruises. But the control was chilling. Food portioned, toys limited to 2, sleep schedules recorded down to the minute. Every detail tracked, every comfort restricted. It wasn't punishment. It was protocol. In the bottom drawer, Quinn found a hard drive. A QR code was taped to the front, alongside a handwritten label. BX-12, final shipments pending, Black Tile Network. She glanced at Briggs. He nodded. No questions were needed. Less than 12 hours later, the FBI officially stepped in. From their Denver field office, they dispatched a tech forensics unit, a tactical response team, and a specialist in cross-border child trafficking operations. The lakefront house was sealed off at first light, its entrance marked with tape and posted guards, while the investigative team transferred all physical evidence to the mobile analysis unit, temporarily erected at the center of town, its interior now glowing with blue screens and hurried footsteps. Shadow, when brought into the precinct, didn't flinch. He didn't pace, he didn't hesitate. Instead, he laid himself down right at the center of the briefing room, as if he were not an animal being consulted but a necessary presence, a silent detective whose instincts needed no translation, his head held high, ears flicking slightly at every rustle of paper, every whispered theory exchanged above his unmoving body. And when Quinn pulled up a satellite map, highlighting abandoned warehouse structures scattered around the outskirts of Greenwood, possible transfer sites used to move individuals without detection, Shadow stood. Calmly. Deliberately. He approached the screen, and with a nose that hovered just an inch above the glowing surface, he pointed to the 4th marker, a cluster of warehouses on the town's southern edge, forgotten since the last lockdown and left to rust under a sky that no longer paid attention. "We need scent confirmation," said Agent Turner, handing Quinn a sealed plastic container, the interior lined with a cloth sample retrieved from the basement of the lake house. Quinn knelt, unsnapped the lid, and placed the container on the floor. Shadow approached, sniffed once, sharp, focused, then immediately turned away, a low whine rising from his throat as he stepped briskly toward the door. No further questions were asked. Every agent in the room rose. A black SUV waited outside. This time Shadow climbed into the back without prompt, the wind tousling his dark gray fur like the edge of a storm, his gaze locked unblinking on the horizon, where the clouds were stacking, thick and urgent, like the weight of something inevitable. They reached the warehouse compound just before sunset, the sky burning with the dying orange of day, its reflection staining the cracked concrete floors in patches of rust and amber, like oil spills that no one ever bothered to clean. No one spoke. But Shadow didn't go inside. Not right away. He paused at the main entrance, scanning the walls with silent precision, then, without warning, darted to the left, vanishing behind the skeletal buildings like a shadow that knew its way through silence. Agents split quickly into formation, following him around the back, where waist-high weeds grew between rows of rusted ventilation ducts and forgotten piping. There, in a shallow depression cracked open by weather and neglect, Shadow began to dig. Not with fury, but with quiet certainty, each movement purposeful, steady, as though he already knew what was waiting beneath the surface. The first layer gave way to nylon. The second revealed the smell of raw wood. The third unearthed a long box, rough-edged, synthetic, the surface scorched with an alphanumeric code. B06, Child Transit Unit. Quinn's hand clenched. Briggs gave a silent nod. The lid was opened. No child inside. Just a stack of meticulously folded children's clothes, a tiny plush pillow, sealed food rations, and one thin slip of paper bearing cold, mechanical print. Delivery, 1600 hours. New location, Gray Hill. Do not harm specimen. Class S. Shadow didn't move. He simply sat beside the box, the glow of the dying sun tracing the line of his back like a ceremonial robe, his eyes fixed westward, toward the outline of Gray Hill, distant and blurred, yet in his eyes it had already become the final destination. Quinn didn't speak. She knelt, laid her palm gently on Shadow's head, not as a gesture of praise, but as an acknowledgement. Then she turned to Jack. He knows the way. Exactly 4 p.m. The timestamp etched in code. 3 vehicles tore out of Greenwood like wind through a broken fence. The lead, an aging pickup driven by Briggs, followed by the tactical SUV unit, and finally the mobile medical van summoned from the nearest rescue outpost. Inside, Quinn sat in the front seat, one hand resting on her thigh beside her holstered weapon, eyes never leaving the GPS monitor. Shadow stood in the rear compartment, not lying down, not whimpering, standing tall, steady, and locked on the west, where the road turned red with dust and dipped into fields of brittle corn, long dead since the last failed harvest. At the end of the dirt road, behind a flimsy wire gate and a faded wooden arch, sat an old farmstead. 1-story, brick-built, roof caved in at the edges, its moss-covered walls leaning like they no longer remembered how to hold themselves upright. There was no chimney smoke, no sound. But in the soil, tire tracks, deep ones, recently made, and heavy. Shadow was the first to cross the fence. He didn't bark, didn't howl, didn't hesitate. He moved like he knew every inch of the place, like the map had always lived in his bones. He stopped outside the old horse barn, no longer echoing with hooves, but heavy with human scent. Fresh cotton fabric, skin oil, and something faint and trembling beneath it all. The sweat of a terrified child, not long past. Quinn raised a hand. Agents dispersed into a containment arc, boots silent against the dry earth. Briggs stayed just behind Jack, weapon drawn, breath tight in his chest. But it was Shadow who breached the door, not with paw or snarl, but with his whole body, a streak of muscle and will barreling through the decaying frame like a bullet fired from the gut of loyalty itself. The hinges snapped, the door flung open. The barn's sour, damp air spilled out into the fading daylight, carrying with it the must of dust, the sting of old hay, and something else, the muffled echo of hope straining against time. And in the corner, bound loosely at the ankle to a splintered table leg, was a child's body. Small, unmoving, hair tangled, eyes closed. Lucy. Her clothes were torn at the sleeves. Her skin was marked by sleeplessness, but unmarred by violence. She didn't cry. She simply trembled. Until Shadow reached her. He slid beside her, lowering himself so that his nose brushed the rope, then her wrist, then her palm. A soft whimper. A single lick. Lucy's eyes fluttered open. Her voice was hoarse, no louder than breath. but clear. "I knew you'd come." Quinn dropped to her knees, pulling at the rope with trembling fingers. Jack didn't wait. He dropped beside them, arms wide, unable to speak, barely breathing, his heart breaking and mending in the same heartbeat as Lucy's small hand reached for his collar, clutching it like a child testing whether the dream was real. And somewhere down the road, racing against dusk, was a black car bearing Elena, summoned only minutes before. But for her, even minutes were too long. But the happiness, fragile, raw, and barely allowed to breathe, didn't last a full minute. There was the sharp screech of a boot heel behind them, a sound slicing through the moment like a blade. From the shadows of the old kitchen, a figure emerged, heavy coat hanging like a curtain of silence, and beneath it, the unmistakable weight of a concealed weapon. Briggs saw him first, shouted with everything he had. "Down!" Bodies dropped. Instincts kicked in. But only one figure rose. Only one being stood between them and the man raising the gun. A single, dark form propelled forward by the sum of 3 months' silent waiting. 3 months spent clawing at dirt, pawing through silence, standing guard at the edge of grief, driven by an instinct deeper than loyalty, older than language, the unshakable refusal of a creature who would not leave without knowing, for certain, that his girl was still alive. Shadow. He hurled himself into the man's chest with every ounce of weight, and will he had left. Gunshots rang out, once, twice, deafening in the narrow space, but miraculously striking no one else. Briggs returned fire before the assailant could take another step back, but by the time the shooter fell, Shadow was already on the floor, his body collapsing onto the splintered wood beneath him. He didn't cry, he didn't whimper, he simply breathed, sharp, shallow, his eyes wide, ribs rising and falling too fast, and from his side, blood spread outward like a quiet red tide, seeping into the edge of Lucy's shirt as she knelt beside him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just lowered herself gently to the floor, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered something into his ear that no one else could hear. Shadow closed his eyes, and for a moment something happened. A tiny movement at the corner of his mouth. The faintest curve, not a snarl, not a twitch, but a smile, rare and strange and full of peace, a gesture Jack would later say he had only seen once before, on the face of a dog who knew he had finished the one thing that mattered most, and was ready, finally, to rest. The sunset reached the threshold of the barn, casting gold across the stained coat of the fallen attacker as the tactical team took control, as Lucy was lifted gently into the waiting ambulance, and as Elena, finally arriving, fell into Jack's arms, one hand on her daughter, the other trembling with the unbearable weight of touching something she had believed for so long could only exist in dreams. And Shadow, carried carefully in Quinn's arms, was still breathing. He never took his eyes off Lucy. Not once. And when the ambulance prepared to depart, the heart monitor beside him gave a steady blink, then dipped once, soft and low. No one said a word, but everyone looked at him, this creature who had rewritten the story of a child not with words, but with paw prints, with breath, with a life stronger than any vow ever sworn by human lips. Shadow lay on the gurney, his breaths shallow but even, his fur damp with sweat and blood, his torso hastily wrapped in thick layers of gauze already darkening beneath the bandages. A veterinary team had been dispatched from a nearby animal emergency unit, prepping a surgical suite in a provisional facility near the hospital. When the ambulance arrived, its lights flicked across sterile white walls, echoing down hallways where every sound had been hushed to nothing but hurried footsteps and the faint squeak of rubber wheels over tile. Lucy was taken into the room next door. She had no serious injuries, but her face was pale, her eyes wide, locked somewhere far behind the veil of recent horror, and in her arms she still held the small pillow from the barn, stained with Shadow's blood. Jack and Elena stood just behind her, their hands clasped, their mouths silent, their eyes fixed on the back of Lucy's head as if willing the universe to keep her within reach. This time, and never let go again. Shadow was moved to the surgical table in a closed room, where the ceiling lights poured down a bluish-white glow across his mottled gray fur, across the long line of blood trailing between light and shadow. The incision sites were marked. Anesthesia began to drip into his veins, and just before the oxygen mask descended over his snout, the door creaked open. Lucy stepped in. No one stopped her. No one dared. In her hands was a small voice recorder, a toy given to her one Christmas when she was 7, something she'd kept hidden through all the long days of captivity, using it in secret to record whispers and thoughts that no one would have believed anyway. She walked up to the table, stood beside Shadow, and with a hand that shook but never faltered, pressed play. Then leaned in close, her lips near his ear, where the breath was faint but still there. "Can you hear me?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't waver. It was quiet like a door creaking open on an empty afternoon. "I knew. Back in that basement room I heard your footsteps in the forest. I wrote a note, hid it under the pillow, saying if anyone still remembered me, please don't stop. That man, he said children are forgotten after the funeral, that if there's no body, the memory fades, like stories no one keeps telling. But you didn't let the memory go. You're the reason they were afraid, because no one guards a grave like you. No one looks at a tombstone and still knows the truth underneath it is a lie." Lucy placed her hand softly on his chest, just above the place where his heart had been stitched back together. Slow but persistent. "I'm not afraid anymore. I remember the night after they took me. It rained. I saw you just outside my window. I didn't cry loud because I knew you were there." Outside the observation window, Quinn stood frozen. Briggs placed a hand on her shoulder, said nothing, but his eyes were red, not from blood, not from fear, but from something deeper. The weight of witnessing a loyalty no one could train, no one could fake, no one could manufacture. A loyalty that asked for nothing, but changed everything. Lucy pressed the stop button on the recorder. She rose from her chair and stepped out of the room, leaving the small device resting gently beside Shadow's ear. Inside the operating theater, the surgeons began their countdown. Anesthetics were increased. The first incision was made along the right side of his abdomen. Shadow's heart still beat, slower now, blood pressure gently falling. But the rhythm remained. It never vanished. While this was unfolding, Quinn received a data file, recently decrypted, from a hard drive retrieved inside the lake house. She opened her laptop in the surgical waiting room, the pale glow of the screen illuminating the lines of exhaustion that had hollowed her face after 2 sleepless nights. Inside the file, a list of 34 children, each with an identification code, physical descriptors, photographs. Many of them had been officially declared dead, accidents, disappearances, or something colder still. Clinical death. 3 names were marked in red. S1, S2, S3. Lucy was S1. But S2, Mila Chen, had vanished from Arkansas 4 years ago. S3, Dante Rowe, was the son of a prominent senator, drowned in the family's private summer estate pool. In the bottom corner of the screen, a pulsing icon blinked quietly. CRW-09, shipment active. Quinn didn't blink. Her jaw tightened, one hand curled into a fist while the other hovered above the keyboard. Her head tilted ever so slightly, as if she'd heard something only she could hear. A scalpel's whisper slicing through the final veil that had kept the truth hidden in plain sight. She stood. The wall clock read 22:06. Shadow had been under for nearly 2 hours. Then, the surgical door light blinked 3 times. It was the silent signal from the lead surgeon. They needed her inside. 6 months later, the sky over Greenwood glowed with the golden cheer of early summer, and the town, washed clean by time and resilience, breathed once again with the ease of a place that had almost forgotten it had once been the center of a federal investigation. The headline of every national broadcast: the edge between salvation and loss. Lucy sat quietly on the front steps of Pine Grove Elementary, a small backpack slung across her shoulders, a fresh sketchbook in her lap. On its cover was a hand-drawn picture: a tall dog with warm brown eyes, standing beside a little girl with braided hair. This was how Lucy had chosen to tell her story, not through interviews, not through questions, but in crayon lines, uneven handwriting, and pages left unbound, because not all stories are meant to be boxed in. Shadow lay at her feet, thinner now, his frame leaner after the massive surgery, but his posture firm, stronger with each passing day. His scar had healed beneath a faint stripe of silver fur, soft and quiet, like a memory that had been stitched back into the skin of time. He still didn't bark much, still preferred silence, but his ears were always listening. And his eyes now held the depth of something that had crossed the desert of the soul and returned. The school had decorated its fence with paper streamers, the children calling her name, shouting with joy, some even unsure if she'd truly ever return. But Lucy didn't rush forward. She knelt beside Shadow, ran her fingers gently over the top of his head, a gesture that had become something more than habit, something sacred. And then she whispered, "Today I'll go first. You can come in tomorrow, okay?" Shadow didn't answer. He never did. But he lowered his ears, tilted his head, and rested his muzzle against her leg. That was enough. That afternoon, in Greenwood's town square, a small stage was set beneath soft white fabric, a simple banner strung above it, honoring Shadow, the silent guardian. There was no national anthem, no booming music, just a soft scattering of applause, awkward at first, then swelling, until finally it filled the square when Lucy stepped onto the platform, holding a slender turquoise leash. Shadow walked beside her, slow, deliberate, sure. Quinn, Briggs, Jack, Elena, and hundreds of Greenwood residents lined the chairs on either side. No one held up a phone. No one streamed the moment live. It was as if, collectively, they knew. This memory was not meant for pixels. It was meant for hearts. Lucy stood before the microphone. Small, still, but unshaken. Her gaze swept across the crowd, then stopped, on Shadow. He sat at the foot of the stage, ears pricked, as if waiting for a melody only she could play. And then Lucy spoke. "If it weren't for him, I would have been forgotten in silence." No one moved, no one whispered, only the breeze stirred. And at the front row, Quinn tilted her head, eyes closed, her hand wrapped tightly around a closed folder that would never be opened again. Lucy continued, her voice quiet but firm, as if the words had been inked inside her long before they ever reached her lips. "People say Shadow's a hero, but he doesn't need medals. He didn't do it to be honored. He did it because he remembered, because he believed." She paused, and because of him, I learned how to believe again. She looked down, unclipped the leash, reached into her pocket, and carefully fastened a small silver pendant around Shadow's neck. Engraved were 4 simple words: Until the last step. Shadow lifted his head. His eyes met Lucy's. And in that moment, the entire town seemed to stop breathing, just to hear what was never said, but always understood. That night, the sky held no clouds. The stars stretched clearly above the forest's edge. Even the pale smear of the Milky Way shimmered behind the northern hills. Lucy sat on the porch, Shadow beside her. No bandages, no medicine, just soft fur, thickening once more, carrying the quiet dignity of a dog who had once been trained for rescue, and then became the rescue. "I think," Lucy said, eyes tilted toward the stars, "the other kids, they're still out there somewhere, waiting for someone not to forget them. The way you didn't forget me." Shadow didn't stir, didn't growl. He simply closed his eyes, as if listening, not to her voice, but to the wind, bringing echoes from far-off ridges where lost things still waited to be found. And the next morning, as the first light touched the roof like a fingertip from the sky, Shadow stood. No urgency, no sound. He walked down the porch steps, past the garden, through the wooden fence Lucy had once decorated with chalk flowers. He paused, looked once towards the cemetery, where once her name had been carved, then turned his head, and his ears twitched, just slightly. From the edge of the forest, a sound. Faint, familiar, the sound of earth being clawed. Soft, but real.